I spent $90,000 on my dream wedding. Custom flowers designer dress, a venue that looked like something from a fairy tale. 200 guests came to celebrate the happiest day of my life. But what they witnessed instead became the nightmare that destroyed my family forever. My twin sister Victoria stood beside me as maid of honor, wearing a smile I'd trusted my entire life. What I didn't know was that she'd been planning this moment for 25 years, waiting for the perfect opportunity to take everything I had, my success, my happiness, my identity, my very existence. I saw her do it during the reception. While guests were laughing and dancing, I watched my own sister slip something into my champagne glass. Sleeping pills. Enough to knock me unconscious. I realized in that frozen moment that this wasn't jealousy. This was something far darker. So I made a split-second decision that would change both our lives forever. I switched our glasses. When Victoria stood to give her toast in front of 200 witnesses, I smiled and raised that switched glass to my lips. She had no idea what was coming. 10 minutes later, the drugs kicked in. But what happened next when she collapsed, and I discovered the true depth of her plan, was beyond anything I could have imagined. Because drugging me was just the beginning. Victoria didn't want to ruin my wedding. She wanted to erase me completely and step into my life as if I'd never existed. This is the story of how my sister tried to steal my identity and how I fought back from inside a nightmare where no one believed I was even real. My name is Grace Hayes. I'm 32 years old, a senior financial consultant who built my career advising tech startups through their growth phases. I'd worked hard to create a life of independence and success, mostly by keeping my professional achievements carefully hidden from my family. But on my wedding day, I thought maybe, just maybe, this would finally be the moment that belonged entirely to me. I was wrong. The morning started with my mother's voice cutting through the bridal suite, like a knife I'd felt 1,000 times before. "Grace, darling, we need Victoria in more of these getting ready photos. She photographs so beautifully, and people will want to remember how lovely she looked today." I watched in the mirror as the makeup artist applied the finishing touches to my face, while my mother fussed over Victoria's hair. My twin sister stood beside me in a bridesmaid dress that wasn't quite white, but wasn't quite anything else either. Champagne, the designer had called it, with intricate beading that caught the light like a wedding gown. When I'd seen it at the final fitting, I'd felt a flutter of concern, but Victoria had squeezed my hand and said, "Oh, Grace, don't be silly. No one could possibly outshine you on your wedding day." My mother had insisted on that dress. "Victoria is so photogenic," she'd explained, as though that settled the matter. "We want the wedding party to look stunning, and you know how the camera loves her." The photographer spent 45 minutes positioning Victoria in the best lighting, asking her to laugh, to look wistful, to hold my bouquet, just for a few shots. I stood to the side, already dressed in my wedding gown, waiting for my turn. This was my wedding day, but somehow I'd already learned to wait my turn in my own story. "Grace, honey, could you step back a bit?" my mother asked during the family portraits. "You're casting a shadow on Victoria. They're perfect." I stepped back. I always stepped back. It was a dance I'd perfected over 32 years. Michael found me during a quiet moment before the ceremony, his face creased with concern. "Hey," he said softly, taking my hands. "You okay? You seem, I don't know, distant." I smiled up at him. This man I'd fallen in love with precisely because he'd met me at a tech conference 300 miles from my hometown, where no one knew about Victoria, where I could just be Grace. "I'm perfect," I told him. "Just wedding day jitters." He studied my face, and I could see he didn't quite believe me. But Michael had only met my family a handful of times in our 2 years together. I'd made sure of that. He had no context for the subtle dynamics, the practiced choreography of diminishment that had shaped my entire life. To him, Victoria was just my twin sister. My family was just being family, and the small moments of discomfort he witnessed were normal wedding stress. He couldn't see the pattern because I'd spent years making sure no one could. The ceremony itself was beautiful. For 30 perfect minutes, I stood at the altar with Michael, and I was the center of attention. But even then, I heard the whispers from guests who'd arrived late. Wait, which one is the bride? I thought the one in the champagne dress was getting married. They're twins. I can't tell them apart. At the reception, Victoria was everywhere. She touched my dress constantly, running her fingers over the lace, the beading, the delicate train. "This is exquisite," she murmured, standing so close I could smell her perfume, the same scent I wore because she'd asked what fragrance I'd chosen and then bought the same one. "You know, I think this style would look even better on me. I have slightly better posture." She laughed when she said it as though it were a joke. Our mother laughed too. "Victoria, come try on Grace's veil for a photo," a cousin called out, and before I could object, Victoria had lifted it from my head. She posed for a dozen pictures, my veil, my flowers, her champagne dress catching the light like a second bride. I watched my sister ask the DJ to play her song, the one she'd claimed as her favorite for years instead of the first dance Michael and I had chosen. The DJ looked to me confused, and I just nodded. It was easier than making a scene. Victoria beamed as our song played, swaying to the music as though this were her celebration. Then she cornered Michael near the bar. I watched from across the room as she peppered him with questions, leaning in close, touching his arm. I couldn't hear the conversation, but I saw her pull out her phone, saw Michael's slightly confused expression as she typed something. Later, he told me she'd been asking detailed questions about our honeymoon, what resort, which room, what activities we'd planned. "She said she wanted to send a surprise gift to the room," Michael explained. "Sweet of her, right?" I'd felt a cold finger trace down my spine, but I'd smiled and agreed. Sweet. That was Victoria. As the evening progressed, I felt the familiar weight of being the supporting actress in my own life. This was my wedding. I'd spent months planning it. Michael and I had invested nearly $90,000 in this day, but somehow Victoria had become the star. Guests clustered around her, drawn to her brightness, her effusive warmth, while I smiled politely and made small talk, feeling increasingly like a ghost at my own celebration. The memory surfaced unbidden as I watched her laugh with a group of my college friends who'd somehow never quite understood why I didn't talk about my family much. I saw us as children 5 years old playing by the lake behind our grandmother's house. I'd wanted the toy boat Victoria was holding. I'd reached for it. She'd stumbled backward. The splash. The terrible silence. Then the screaming mine, my mother's strangers running toward the water. They'd pulled Victoria out, blue and still water streaming from her mouth. The paramedics worked for 3 minutes. That felt like 3 hours before she coughed and gasped and came back to life. My mother had held her sobbing while I stood to the side, soaking wet, knowing somehow that I'd done something unforgivable. The family never spoke about it. Victoria slipped, became the official story. But I knew. And every time my mother looked at me with that particular expression, disappointment mixed with something harder, I knew she knew too. "You need to take care of your sister," my mother had told me countless times over the years. "After what happened, after what she went through, you owe her that." I'd spent 25 years trying to pay that debt. Victoria appeared beside me as Michael and I prepared to cut the cake, the photographer positioning us for the shot. She stood so close that our arms touched, and when I glanced at her, I saw something in her eyes I couldn't quite name. Not quite anger, not quite joy. Something calculating and cold. She leaned in her lips, nearly touching my ear. Her voice so quiet that only I could hear her beneath the music and laughter of 200 guests. 25 years ago, you took something from me. Tonight, I take it back." Then she stepped away, smiling brilliantly for the cameras, leaving me frozen with the cake knife in my hand and ice flooding through my veins. I stood there with the knife hovering over the cake, Victoria's whispered threat echoing in my ears. Before I could process what she'd meant, Michael's hand covered mine warm and steady, guiding the blade through the pristine white fondant. The photographer's flash went off. Everyone applauded. I smiled reflexively, the same smile I'd perfected over 3 decades of pretending everything was fine. My mother appeared at my elbow as Michael went to greet some late-arriving guests. She steered me toward a quiet corner near the French doors, away from the celebration. I knew that grip on my arm firm but not quite painful. I'd felt it 1,000 times before. "Grace, darling, I need to speak with you," she said, her voice carrying that particular tone that made my stomach clench. "I've been watching Victoria tonight and I'm concerned." Of course she was concerned about Victoria. On my wedding day. I waited because I knew what was coming. The script never changed, only the occasion. "You know, Victoria has never been quite the same since the accident." My mother continued, and I felt the familiar weight settling onto my shoulders like a lead cloak. "The doctors said the oxygen deprivation affected her development. They were very clear about that the brain damage was subtle but permanent. It affected her emotional regulation, her ability to process certain social cues. You owe her more than anyone can repay, Grace. You owe her your unconditional support, always." I'd heard these exact words in this exact order more times than I could count. After I graduated summa cum laude from college while Victoria dropped out twice, you owe her unconditional support. When I landed my first major consulting contract and Victoria's boutique failed within 6 months, you owe her more than anyone can repay. When I tried to set a boundary, any boundary at all, after what you did, Grace, you don't have the right to say no. The debt was never paid because it could never be paid. I was 5 years old when it happened, barely old enough to understand cause and effect, but I'd been sentenced to a lifetime of atonement for an accident I couldn't have prevented. "I understand, Mom," I said quietly, because disagreeing only made it worse. "Do you?" Her eyes searched mine, sharp and knowing. "Because I've noticed you've been distant with Victoria lately, less willing to help her. She mentioned you didn't return her calls for a week last month." That week I'd been closing a $2 million consulting deal for a startup going public. I'd been working 18-hour days, sleeping in my office. But I couldn't tell my mother that, because my mother didn't know about my real career. She thought I was a mid-level administrative assistant at a small financial firm making maybe $50,000 a year. She had no idea I was a senior consultant pulling in a high 6-figure income, that I owned a condo in another city, under an LLC, that I had substantial retirement accounts and investments that would make her head spin. I'd learned to hide my success the hard way. 6 years ago, giddy with my first major promotion, I'd made the mistake of mentioning it at a family dinner. My mother's face had lit up, not with pride for me, but with calculation. Within an hour, she'd asked me to fund Victoria's third business venture, a wellness center, that required $80,000 in startup capital. "Grace, this is Victoria's dream," my mother had said. "After everything she's been through, after what the accident took from her, don't you think you owe her this chance? You're doing so well. Surely you can spare it." When I'd hesitated, trying to explain that a promotion didn't mean I had that kind of liquid cash available, my mother's expression had turned cold. "Selfish," she'd said quietly. "After what you did to her, after you nearly killed her, you're going to deny her this. You're going to choose money over your sister's happiness." The guilt had been crushing. I'd taken out a personal loan and given Victoria the money. The wellness center closed within 8 months. Victoria never mentioned paying me back. My mother never mentioned it again. That's when I learned to be invisible in my success the same way I'd learned to be invisible in my family. I created separate bank accounts my family couldn't trace. I registered my consulting business under my middle name, Grace Eleanor Consulting, so it wouldn't come up in casual searches. I stopped mentioning work entirely, deflecting questions with vague responses about paperwork and boring office stuff. Only Michael knew the truth. Only Michael had met Grace, the successful consultant, the woman who commanded rooms full of executives who negotiated million-dollar deals with confidence and skill. To my family, I was still the quiet, apologetic girl who owed a debt that could never be repaid. I watched Victoria now across the reception hall. She was laughing with a group of my college friends, animated and bright. She caught my eye and smiled, but there was something in that smile that made my skin prickle. She'd been watching me all day with an intensity that went beyond normal sibling attention. The way she'd memorized details about my honeymoon, the way she'd insisted on trying on my veil, the way her hands kept touching my dress as though claiming it. "You took something from me," she'd whispered. What did that mean? I'd already given her everything, my guilt, my achievements diminished to make room for hers, my boundaries erased to accommodate her needs. What more could there possibly be to take? I thought about the way Victoria talked about me to others when she thought I couldn't hear. "Grace has always been so lucky," she'd say, her voice carrying an edge of resentment. "Everything just falls into her lap. Perfect grades, perfect career, perfect boyfriend. Some people get all the breaks." She never mentioned that my perfect grades came from studying until 2 a.m. while she partied. She never acknowledged that my perfect career was built through years of 80-hour weeks and ruthless self-discipline. In Victoria's mind, I'd stolen the good fortune that rightfully belonged to her. The accident at the lake hadn't just damaged her brain, it had fractured her entire sense of reality. Our family had spent 25 years reinforcing that fractured reality. Every time they reminded me of my debt, they reminded Victoria that she was owed. Every time they centered her pain, they validated her belief that the world had cheated her. Every time they demanded I sacrifice for her, they taught her that my life existed for her benefit. I looked at my mother now, at the stern set of her mouth, and understood something I'd never quite articulated before. She didn't want me to succeed. Success meant independence, and independence meant I might finally refuse to pay the debt. As long as I stayed small, apologetic, guilty, I stayed controllable. "I'll talk to Victoria." I told my mother the words automatic. "Make sure she knows I'm here for her." My mother's expression softened. "That's my good girl. Family comes first, Grace. Always remember that." She walked away, satisfied, leaving me standing alone near the French doors. Through the glass I could see Victoria's reflection. She was staring at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Not quite hatred, not quite triumph, but something cold and calculated that made my blood run cold. What I didn't understand yet, what I couldn't possibly imagine in that moment, was that Victoria's sense of what she was owed had evolved far beyond money or attention, or even my endless apologies. In her damaged, obsessive mind, I hadn't just taken her health that day at the lake. I'd taken her entire life, and she believed she had every right to take mine in return. I needed air. The reception was in full swing, but the walls felt like they were closing in. I slipped out to the garden terrace where white lights were strung between trees, creating a canopy of soft illumination. This was supposed to be the happiest day of my life, and instead I felt like I was suffocating under the weight of 25 years of guilt. Michael found me there moments later, concern etched across his face. "Hey," he said softly, wrapping his jacket around my shoulders. "Talk to me. What did your mom say?" I leaned into him, breathing in his familiar scent, coffee and cedar, and something uniquely Michael. He was the only person in my life who saw me clearly, who knew the truth about who I really was, beyond the family narrative of Grace the eternal debtor. "The usual," I said, reminding me what I owe Victoria, making sure I remember my place. Michael's jaw tightened. We'd had this conversation before dozens of times over our 2 years together. "Grace, you don't owe her your whole life. You were 5 years old. It was an accident." "You don't understand," I said, and I heard the defensive note in my voice. "You didn't see her lying there blue and lifeless. You didn't hear the doctors explain about the brain damage, the oxygen deprivation. My mother's right. Victoria was never the same after that day." "And that's tragic," Michael said, taking my hands. "But it doesn't make you responsible for every aspect of her life forever. When are you going to tell them the truth about your career, about what you've actually accomplished?" Never, I thought. But I didn't say it out loud. Michael had met me at a tech conference in San Francisco 3 years ago. I'd been the keynote speaker presenting on financial strategies for startups navigating their first major funding rounds. He'd approached me afterward, impressed by my presentation, and we'd talked for hours about venture capital scaling strategies and the challenges of the tech industry. He'd fallen in love with that Grace, the confident consultant who commanded respect in boardrooms, who negotiated million-dollar deals without flinching. He'd been shocked when he met my family for the first time and watched me shrink into someone he barely recognized. The transformation had been instantaneous, my voice quieter, my shoulders hunched, my successes minimized to the point of invisibility. Afterward, he'd been bewildered. "Who was that?" he'd asked. "That wasn't you in there. Where did my Grace go?" I'd tried to explain the dynamics, the history, the debt, but Michael came from a healthy family where achievements were celebrated and boundaries were respected. He couldn't fully grasp how I'd learned to make myself small to survive, how sharing my success with my family was like throwing chum to sharks. The truth was that Grace Eleanor Consulting was one of the most sought-after financial advisory firms for tech startups in 3 states. I'd built it from nothing, working 100-hour weeks while simultaneously maintaining the fiction of being a low-level administrative assistant. My family thought I made $50,000 a year. My actual income was closer to $350,000, with a particularly good year hitting $500,000. I owned a 2-bedroom condo in Portland under an LLC Hayes Investment Properties that my mother couldn't trace. I had retirement accounts worth more than my parents' house. I maintained separate bank accounts at institutions my family had never heard of. My business cards listed only my middle name and didn't include my last name, making it nearly impossible for casual searches to connect me to Grace Hayes, the perpetually apologetic daughter. I'd put myself through college working 3 jobs, while my parents paid for Victoria's tuition at 4 different universities as she cycled through majors: art history, psychology, business, and finally communications before dropping out entirely each time. I'd lived in a studio apartment with 2 roommates and survived on ramen, while Victoria lived in a sorority house and posted Instagram photos of weekend trips to wine country funded by our parents. Every achievement I'd earned, I'd learned to hide. Every promotion came with an elaborate cover story. When I bought my condo, I told my mother I was house-sitting for a friend. When I traveled for business, I said I was on vacation funded by credit card points. The web of lies was exhausting, but it was safer than the truth. "After we're married," Michael said, now his voice gentle but firm, "I think we should create some distance from your family, not cut them off, just healthy boundaries. Move to Portland permanently. Maybe see them a few times a year instead of every month. Give yourself room to breathe." I'd resisted this conversation every time he brought it up. Part of me knew he was right, but another part, the part that still remembered my mother's expression when they pulled Victoria from the lake, couldn't quite let go. I still wanted their approval. I still hoped that somehow, someday, I could pay off the debt and be free. "Maybe," I said non-committally. "Let's talk about it after the honeymoon." Michael looked like he wanted to argue, but he just kissed my forehead. "Okay, after the honeymoon. But Grace, I need you to hear this. You deserve to take up space. You deserve to be seen, and you sure as hell deserve to be proud of what you've built." We returned to the reception, and I felt marginally better. In a few hours, this would all be over. Michael and I would retreat to the honeymoon suite upstairs, the hotel's best room overlooking the lake, which I'd paid for with my own money. Tomorrow we'd fly to Bali for 2 weeks of peace and distance from all of this. Earlier that morning, during the chaos of getting ready, I'd taken all my important documents to the honeymoon suite and locked them in the room's safe. My passport, social security card, backup credit cards, copies of financial documents I'd need for an international trip, everything that proved who I really was and what I really had. I'd planned to transfer them to my luggage later, but with the ceremony and reception, I'd run out of time. They were secure there, locked away where no one could access them. Victoria had been with me when I'd made that trip to the suite. She'd helped me carry some of the gifts that had arrived early, chattering about how beautiful the room was, how romantic. When I'd opened the safe to store my documents, she'd watched over my shoulder. "What's the combination?" she'd asked casually. just in case you lock yourself out and need me to grab something for you." I'd laughed and told her without thinking, Buttons 993, our childhood golden retriever's name and the year we'd gotten him. It had seemed harmless at the time, sisterly even sharing that small detail. Victoria had smiled and said how sweet it was that I'd chosen something meaningful. I'd thought nothing of it. Why would I? The documents were mine in my room, secured behind a combination only Michael and Victoria knew. There was no reason for anyone to access them. As I watched Victoria across the reception hall, now laughing with guests and looking radiant in her champagne-colored dress, I felt a flutter of unease that I couldn't quite name. But I pushed it down. My real life, my career, my assets, my carefully constructed independence existed in a separate world from this family dysfunction. Victoria had no idea about Grace Eleanor Consulting or the condo in Portland or the substantial accounts I'd built. My separate life would remain separate. That world was mine, protected by layers of careful deception and geographic distance. What I didn't know was that Victoria had been mapping every detail of that separate world for 6 months, piece by patient piece, waiting for exactly this moment. What I didn't know, what I couldn't have known as I stood in that reception hall surrounded by 200 guests, was that my twin sister had been preparing for this night for 6 months. While I'd been planning a wedding, Victoria had been planning something far more sinister. It started the day I called to tell my family about Michael's proposal. I'd been nervous knowing how my mother would react, how Victoria would find a way to make it about herself. But I'd been hopeful, too stupidly hopeful, that maybe this time would be different. Victoria's congratulations had sounded genuine over the phone. "Oh, Grace, I'm so happy for you," she'd gushed. "Tell me everything about the proposal. I want to hear every detail." I'd shared it all, relieved by her enthusiasm, grateful for what felt like authentic sisterly joy. What I didn't see was Victoria sitting in her apartment phone on speaker, taking notes with methodical precision. She'd started a file that day, a detailed dossier on Grace Hayes's life habits, mannerisms, everything that made me who I was. Over the following months, Victoria studied me the way a method actor studies a role. At family dinners, she positioned herself across the room where she could watch me without seeming obvious. She observed how I held my coffee cup pinky slightly extended in a habit I'd picked up from my college roommate. She noted my distinctive laugh, the way it started soft and built to something more genuine. She watched how I tucked my hair behind my right ear when I was nervous or uncomfortable, a tell I'd never realized I had. She filmed me secretly at Thanksgiving, capturing the way I moved, spoke, gestured. Late at night in her apartment, she'd practice in front of a mirror, perfecting the slight head tilt I did when listening intently, the way I crossed my legs left over right, the specific cadence of my speech patterns. Victoria spent hours practicing my signature. She'd stolen a credit card receipt from my purse during Christmas and used it as a reference, filling notebooks with my name until her version was indistinguishable from mine. She studied the loops, the pressure points, the slight leftward slant of my handwriting. By February, she could forge my signature perfectly. But studying me in person wasn't enough. Victoria needed access to the life I'd hidden from the family, the professional world I'd kept carefully separate. She created fake social media profiles, professional headshots stolen from stock photo sites, elaborate backstories, convincing credentials. She befriended my colleagues on LinkedIn, posing as a potential client or fellow consultant. Through carefully crafted conversations, she extracted details about Grace Eleanor, consulting my client list, my professional reputation, the projects I'd worked on. She joined my yoga studio in Portland, claiming she'd moved to the area and asking the instructor which classes were popular. When told that Saturday morning vinyasa was packed, she'd asked innocently, "Oh, is that the one Grace Hayes goes to?" The instructor, making small talk, had confirmed it. Victoria started attending, always positioning her mat where she could observe me in the mirror. She learned my flexibility, my limitations, the modifications I made for an old ankle injury. What chilled me most, when I eventually pieced this together, was the drug research. Victoria had been methodical, clinical even. She'd used computers at public libraries, creating anonymous email accounts accessing the dark web through VPNs that couldn't be traced. She'd researched sedatives with obsessive detail, looking for something fast-acting that would mimic alcohol intoxication before causing unconsciousness. She'd found what she needed through encrypted forums, a designer benzodiazepine that worked within 15 minutes, causing euphoria and confusion before rapidly progressing to deep sedation. She'd purchased it using cryptocurrency, having taught herself the basics of untraceable transactions. But one drug wasn't enough for what she had planned. The second purchase was darker, a respiratory suppressant, the kind used in anesthesia, but dangerous in uncontrolled doses. In the right amount administered to someone already unconscious, it would cause breathing to slow, then stop. To outside observers, it would look like a tragic reaction to alcohol and sedatives, or possibly even natural causes. An autopsy might find the drugs, but in the chaos of a wedding with an open bar, it would be ruled accidental. Victoria tested both substances on herself in microdoses, documenting her reactions in a journal she kept hidden. She needed to understand the timeline, precisely how long before symptoms appeared, how quickly consciousness faded, what the physical presentation looked like. She made herself sick repeatedly, all in service of perfecting her plan. She even created a false medical history for me, forging pharmacy records that showed Grace Hayes had been prescribed anti-anxiety medication for years. She built a paper trail of a woman struggling with stress taking medication, someone whose death from an accidental overdose would be tragic but believable. But Victoria knew she couldn't execute the financial aspects of her plan alone. She needed someone with expertise in asset transfer, someone who understood how to move money without triggering fraud alerts. That's when she reached out to Nathan Webb. Nathan and I had history, though I'd tried to forget it. 2 years ago, before I met Michael, Nathan had pursued me aggressively after we'd been introduced at a financial networking event. He was a financial advisor with a mid-tier firm, handsome in a calculated way, successful enough to be confident. He'd asked me out repeatedly, unable to accept my polite refusals. When politeness failed, I'd been direct. I wasn't interested. Please stop asking. Nathan had escalated, showing up at my office, sending expensive gifts, calling at inappropriate hours. I'd finally reported him to his firm's HR department, resulting in a formal warning on his record. He'd been humiliated, angry, and I'd heard through professional networks that he blamed me for damaging his reputation. Victoria had found him through careful research, identifying him as someone with both the skills she needed and a personal grudge against me. She'd approached him in a coffee shop near his office. Her proposal, simple and devastating, help her steal Grace's identity and assets, split everything 50-50. Nathan had listened, intrigued despite himself. Victoria laid out what she'd learned about my hidden wealth, the Portland condo, the substantial accounts, the successful consulting business our family knew nothing about. She'd done her homework, accessing public records, cross-referencing LLCs, piecing together a financial picture that even Nathan found impressive. Grace humiliated me, Nathan had said, and Victoria had nodded with manufactured sympathy. She cost me a promotion. She made me look like a predator when I was just interested. She's always thought she was better than everyone, Victoria had agreed, playing to his resentment. She's built this whole secret life, hiding money from her own family. She deserves to lose everything. Over 4 months, they'd crafted their conspiracy. Nathan created falsified power of attorney documents, practiced forging my signature using samples Victoria provided, and established offshore accounts designed to receive transferred funds gradually. Victoria's role was to become me physically, to take over my identity so completely that no one would question her authority to access my assets. They planned the timeline meticulously. Once I was incapacitated, unconscious first, then dead from the respiratory suppressant, Victoria would step into my role. She'd play the grieving twin sister initially, but over days and weeks, she'd begin the transformation. She'd move into my condo, access. My accounts become Grace Hayes in every legal and practical sense. Nathan would handle the financial transfers, moving money in amounts small enough to avoid immediate detection, but large enough to drain my accounts within months. By the time anyone thought to investigate, the money would be untraceable, dispersed through cryptocurrency exchanges and international banks with strict privacy laws. Their plan wasn't just theft. It wasn't just murder. It was complete erasure, the systematic dismantling of Grace Hayes's existence, so that Victoria could inhabit the life she believed should have been hers all along, and I knew none of it. As I smiled at wedding guests and cut cake and danced with my new husband, I had no idea that my twin sister had spent 6 months learning to become me, that she'd recruited an accomplice, that she'd purchased drugs and forged documents, and built an entire infrastructure designed to make me disappear. Victoria's plan wasn't to hurt me. It was to erase me completely and step into my life as if I had never existed at all. The reception moved into its final hour, guests mingling with champagne and dessert. I'd left the main table to thank some of Michael's colleagues who'd traveled from Seattle for the wedding. The conversation was pleasant, normal, exactly what a wedding should be. I felt lighter than I had all day, ready to put the family tensions behind me and focus on the life Michael and I were building together. When I returned to the table, my champagne flute was where I'd left it, the golden liquid catching the candlelight. But something made me pause. A flicker of movement behind the elaborate floral centerpiece caught my eye. White roses and eucalyptus arranged so tall they partially obscured the view across the table. Victoria stood there, leaning over my place, setting her back to the room. Her hand moved with quick, practiced precision, pulling something from her small beaded clutch. A vial no larger than my thumb filled with clear liquid. I watched frozen as she tilted it over my champagne glass, just a few drops before slipping the vial back into her clutch and straightening up. The whole motion took maybe 5 seconds. Efficient, rehearsed. My mind stuttered, trying to process what I'd just witnessed. This couldn't be what it looked like. Victoria couldn't, there had to be an innocent explanation. Maybe it was one of those flavor enhancers people used. Maybe she'd added water to dilute the alcohol because she thought I'd had too much. Maybe I'd misunderstood what I'd seen. But the furtive nature of it, the way she'd checked to make sure no one was watching, the practiced speed of her movements, all of it screamed intention. Secrecy. Something wrong. I approached the table slowly, my heart hammering. I needed to think clearly, to not overreact. If I was wrong, if there was an innocent explanation, making a scene would be mortifying. This was my wedding. 200 guests were watching. I couldn't accuse my own sister of what exactly? What did I think she'd done? I reached for a different glass, one belonging to the empty seat beside mine, planning to quietly switch them while adjusting the place settings. Just in case. Just to be safe. "Oh, Grace, here's your special champagne!" Victoria's voice rang out bright and clear. She appeared beside me, all smiles, holding my original glass. "I made sure they used the vintage you requested, the Veuve Clicquot. Right, I told the bartender you're very particular about your champagne." Several guests nearby turned at her voice, smiling at this sweet, sisterly gesture. Victoria thrust the glass toward me, and I stared at it like it was a snake. I was just... I stammered, aware of the eyes on us. "Don't be silly, you have to toast with the good stuff." Victoria continued, her smile unwavering, but something cold flickering in her eyes. "You only get married once, right?" Michael's aunt was watching us, beaming. The photographer had turned his camera our way, capturing this moment of sisterly love. A waiter paused nearby, waiting to refill glasses. The social pressure was enormous. A dozen people were now paying attention to this small interaction, and they all expected me to gracefully accept my sister's thoughtful gesture. I took the glass. What else could I do? Make a scene. Accuse Victoria in front of everyone, based on what? A few drops from a vial I'd barely seen. My lifelong conditioning to avoid conflict, to not cause problems, to be the good, understanding sister kicked in automatically. "Thank you," I heard myself say. The glass felt impossibly heavy in my hand. Victoria raised her own champagne. "To my beautiful sister," she announced loud enough for nearby tables to hear, "may you have everything you deserve." The odd phrasing made my skin prickle, but guests were already raising their glasses in response. I lifted mine, the golden liquid reflecting candlelight. I could set it down after the toast. I could claim I felt ill-needed water instead. I just needed to get through this moment without creating a scene. I took a sip, small, barely wetting my lips, planning to set the glass down immediately. But Victoria was still watching, still smiling that strange smile, and I found myself taking a second sip to satisfy whatever test this was. The champagne tasted normal, crisp, slightly sweet, expensive. Nothing obviously wrong. I set the glass down and turned to respond to a question from Michael's father about our honeymoon plans. The conversation flowed around me normal and pleasant, and I started to think I'd overreacted. Stress and family dynamics had made me paranoid. Victoria had probably just added water, or the first wave of dizziness hit about 10 minutes later. I was standing talking to my college roommate about her new job when the room tilted slightly. I blinked, trying to clear my vision, but everything had gone soft around the edges. "Grace, you okay?" My roommate's voice sounded distant, echoing. "I'm fine," I said, but my own voice sounded strange to my ears. "Just tired. It's been a long day." I tried to take a step toward my chair and stumbled. My legs felt heavy, disconnected from my body. The room spun lazily like I was on a carousel picking up speed. Strong hands caught my elbow. Victoria's hands. "Whoa there," she said, her voice projecting concern perfectly. "Grace, honey, when's the last time you ate?" I tried to focus on her face, but it kept blurring. I'm not." "She barely touched her dinner," Victoria announced to the growing cluster of concerned guests. "And she's been so stressed about everything being perfect. The champagne must have hit her hard." People made sympathetic noises. Someone mentioned how brides often forget to eat on their wedding day. Michael appeared worry, creasing his forehead, reaching for me. "I've got her," Victoria said firmly, wrapping an arm around my waist. "Let me take her upstairs to rest. I know exactly what she needs, sister intuition. You stay here, enjoy the party. I'll get her comfortable and come right back." "Maybe I should come," Michael started, but Victoria was already steering me away, her grip surprisingly strong. "Trust me, she'll be embarrassed if too many people fuss," Victoria said over her shoulder. "Just needs to lie down for a bit. I'll take care of my sister." I tried to protest, tried to tell Michael that something was wrong, that he should come with us, but the words came out slurred and incoherent. My tongue felt thick, my thoughts sluggish. The floor seemed to move beneath my feet, like I was walking on a ship's deck in rough seas. Victoria guided me toward the hotel lobby, toward the elevators, and I couldn't make my body resist. Guests parted around us, faces blurred and concerned. I heard fragments of conversation, "Poor thing," "stress," "too much champagne," and wanted to scream that it wasn't that something was terribly wrong. The elevator doors closed, and we were alone. Victoria's concerned expression dropped like a mask, replaced by something cold and triumphant. She leaned close, her face inches from mine, and whispered in my ear, "Finally, it's my turn." The elevator rose, and my consciousness began to sink. The last thing I registered before the world went dark was Victoria's reflection in the elevator's mirrored walls, my identical twin, wearing my smile, standing where I should be standing. My world went dark, and when I woke, if I woke, nothing would ever be the same. I remember fragments like a film reel with half the frames missing, the honeymoon suite door opening, Victoria lowering me onto the bed, positioning me carefully on my stomach, the rustle of fabric, the sound of her rummaging through her clutch. I tried to speak, to move, but my body wouldn't respond. I was trapped inside myself, conscious but paralyzed. Then a sharp pinch at the back of my thigh like a bee sting. I couldn't see what she was doing, couldn't turn my head. Victoria's voice, clinical and detached, counting under her breath. 1, 2, 3. The pressure increased briefly, then released. Footsteps moving away. I tried to catalog what was happening, tried to hold on to consciousness, but it was like trying to grasp smoke. The darkness kept pulling at me, insistent and irresistible. My last coherent thought was that I needed to stay awake, needed to understand what Victoria had done, but even that thought fragmented and dissolved. Time became meaningless. Sometimes I surfaced just enough to register sensations, voices, movement, brightness that hurt even through closed eyelids. But consciousness wouldn't stick. I'd grasp at awareness only to have it slip away before I could make sense of anything. Later, much later, when I could finally piece together what happened during those lost hours, the clinical precision of Victoria's performance made me physically ill. She'd waited exactly 12 minutes after administering the second drug before calling 911. I learned this from the paramedic report, the timestamp cold and factual. 12 minutes long enough for the respiratory suppressant to begin affecting my breathing, short enough to seem like she'd acted the moment she noticed something wrong. The 911 recording was played for me months afterward during legal proceedings. I could barely recognize my sister's voice on it, raw with manufactured panic. "My sister collapsed. She's not breathing right. I think she's having a reaction to something. Please, please send someone." The tremor in her voice was perfect. The timing of her sobs calibrated for maximum believability. She'd practiced this, I realized with horror. She'd rehearsed the call the same way she'd rehearsed my signature. When paramedics arrived, Victoria's performance continued. She met them at the suite door, face streaked with tears, hands visibly shaking. "I don't know what happened," she told them, her voice breaking. "We were at her wedding. She seemed fine, and then she started acting strange, and I brought her up here to rest, and she stopped breathing properly." I was told she rode in the ambulance holding my hand, providing my medical history to the EMTs with the perfect blend of worry and helpfulness. But she'd laced the truth with poison. "She's been so anxious lately about the wedding, the planning, all of it. I'm worried she might have been taking pills she didn't tell anyone about. Anti-anxiety medication, maybe? And she drank quite a bit of champagne at the reception. I tried to tell her to slow down, but you know how brides are, she wanted everything to be perfect." The EMTs had noted it all, documenting Grace Hayes as a possible overdose case mixing alcohol with undisclosed medications. The foundation of Victoria's lie was being laid in real time by medical professionals who had no reason to doubt the concerned twin sister. At the hospital, I drifted in a fog of semi-consciousness, aware of bright lights and urgent voices, but unable to respond. I felt myself being moved, examined, prodded. Voices discussed medications and symptoms, debating what combination of substances could cause this presentation. "Which one is the patient?" I heard someone ask, and through the haze I understood the critical moment had arrived. Victoria's voice, steady, now helpful. "I'm Grace Hayes. That's my twin sister Victoria on the bed. Our mother is on her way. She's extremely worried. Victoria has been struggling lately. I probably should have said something sooner, but I didn't want to believe it was serious." The exhausted ER nurse working the overnight shift, processing her dozenth patient of the night, made a note on the chart. 2 identical women, one conscious and coherent, one unconscious and incoherent. The assumption was natural, inevitable. The conscious one must be Grace Hayes, the bride. The unconscious one must be Victoria, the troubled sister. I wanted to scream that it was wrong that I was Grace, but I couldn't make my body obey. My mouth wouldn't form words. My eyes wouldn't open. I was a prisoner in my own flesh while my sister stole my name, my identity, my very existence. Hours passed in a blur of tests and monitoring. I was stabilized, moved to a private room hooked to IVs and monitors. At some point, Michael came. I sensed his presence, heard his worried voice asking if I'd be okay. Victoria, playing her role perfectly, comforted him. "The doctors say she'll recover. She just needs rest and proper care. I'm so sorry this happened on your wedding night." The next clear memory I have is of Victoria's voice, quieter now, speaking to someone just outside my room. A doctor male with an accent I couldn't place. Their conversation was hushed but purposeful. "Dr. Chen, I need your advice about Victoria's long-term care," I heard her say. Heard her call me, "Victoria, claim my name as her own." This isn't the first time she's had an episode like this. She's been in treatment before, though she'd never admit it to anyone. "Do you have documentation of previous psychiatric care?" the doctor asked. "Yes, I brought copies of her medical records. I've been keeping them in case something like this happened." The rustle of papers. See here 3 previous hospitalizations for mental health crises, anxiety, depression medication, mismanagement. Our family has tried to keep it quiet, but I think Victoria needs more intensive help than we can provide. I would learn later that Dr. Chen was not the attending physician randomly assigned to my case. He was a doctor Nathan had identified, researched, and approached weeks earlier. A doctor with gambling debts and a willingness to bend rules for the right price. A doctor who would accept forged medical records without scrutinizing them too carefully. These records indicate a pattern of instability, Dr. Chen said, his voice carefully neutral. Given her current presentation and history, I'd recommend transfer to a specialized psychiatric facility. Serenity Hills has an excellent reputation for cases like this. Would that be appropriate? I mean, she's only been here a few hours. For someone with this history and a concerning medication interaction, early intervention is crucial. Serenity Hills can provide the level of monitoring and care she needs. I can facilitate the transfer if you'd like. Victoria's pause was perfectly timed, as though she were wrestling with a difficult decision rather than executing a predetermined plan. If you think it's best for Victoria, then yes. I trust your judgment, doctor. I just want my sister to get well. Michael was told the plan later that morning. I wasn't conscious for that conversation, but he recounted it to me eventually, his voice heavy with guilt. Victoria had approached him in the hospital cafeteria, her face drawn with worry, explaining that Victoria needed specialized psychiatric care, that this breakdown had been building for a long time, that the wedding stress had just been the trigger. I had no reason not to believe her. Michael told me later, his eyes haunted. She's your sister. She seemed genuinely concerned. And I'd only met your family a few times. I didn't know the dynamics well enough to question anything. I thought I was being supportive by trusting her judgment about what you needed. Within 24 hours of my collapse, I was transferred to Serenity Hills, a private psychiatric facility 40 miles outside the city. The transfer was handled quietly, professionally. I was loaded into a medical transport vehicle, still unconscious, still helpless, while Victoria signed paperwork authorizing my admission under the name Victoria Hayes. As the ambulance pulled away from the hospital, Victoria returned to the hotel. She went to the honeymoon suite my suite paid for with my money meant for my wedding night. She opened the safe using the combination I'd thoughtlessly given her. Inside, she found everything she needed: my passport, my social security card, my backup credit cards, copies of financial documents. She stood in front of the full-length mirror and slowly, deliberately removed her champagne-colored bridesmaid dress. Then she opened the closet where my wedding dress hung pristine and perfect, waiting for a honeymoon that would never happen. Victoria lifted the dress from its hanger and stepped into it, pulling it up over her body, my body's identical twin. She reached behind herself to zip it up, adjusted the fit, smoothed the lace over her hips. In the mirror, she saw Grace Hayes in a wedding dress. She smiled at her reflection, practicing my smile, and whispered to the empty room, "Perfect fit." The first 3 days at Serenity Hills exist in my memory, as fragments, fleeting moments of consciousness that surfaced and sank like a drowning person gasping for air. I would wake just enough to register white walls, fluorescent lights, the chemical smell of industrial cleaners mixed with something medicinal. Then the darkness would pull me back under before I could make sense of where I was, or why. Sometimes I heard voices. A nurse speaking in soothing tones about medication schedules, a doctor discussing acute psychotic episodes and sedation protocols, and Victoria's voice concerned and loving, saying words that made no sense. I just want my sister Victoria to feel safe and comfortable, whatever she needs to heal. I tried to speak during those brief surfacing moments, tried to explain that my name was Grace, that something terrible had happened, that I needed help. But my tongue was thick and uncooperative, my thoughts scattered like marbles on a tilted floor. The words that came out were slurred nonsense, and I'd see the nurse's expression shift from attentive to professionally sympathetic, the look healthcare workers give patients who are clearly delusional. "It's okay, Victoria," the nurse would say gently. "You're safe here. Just rest." Then another injection, Another slide into medicated oblivion. What I didn't know, what I couldn't know in my drugged state, was that my sedation therapy was being carefully orchestrated. The facility's administrator, a man named Gerald Hutchins, had been contacted by Nathan weeks before the wedding. Nathan had researched which private psychiatric facilities had financial troubles, which administrators might be vulnerable to persuasion, which doctors had questionable ethics. Serenity Hills was perfect. High-end enough to seem legitimate, struggling enough to need money, small enough that oversight was lax. Gerald Hutchins had gambling debts Nathan knew about. The offer was simple. Accept a patient under sedation protocols, ask no questions, ensure she remains comfortably unconscious, and receive $50,000 in untraceable cash. Hutchins convinced himself he wasn't doing anything wrong. The patient had documented psychiatric history. The sister was paying all bills promptly. The treating physician had ordered the sedation. If the patient needed to be kept calm and resting for a week or two while family sorted out long-term care arrangements, where was the harm? Victoria visited every day, playing the role of devoted sister with Academy Award-worthy dedication. She'd arrive in the afternoon dressed in clothes I later realized were mine, my tailored blazers, my understated jewelry. She'd sit beside my bed, hold my unresponsive hand, and speak to nurses about how worried she was. "Has Victoria said anything coherent today?" She'd ask, her voice breaking slightly. "I keep hoping she'll recognize me, that we'll have a moment of connection." The nurses would shake their heads sympathetically. "She's very confused when she does wake up. Keeps insisting her name is Grace. The delusion is quite strong." "That's what I was afraid of," Victoria would say, dabbing at her eyes. "She's always been a bit envious of me, but I never thought it would progress to this, actually believing she is me. It's heartbreaking." By day 4, I was still barely conscious, still unable to fight the medications being pumped into my system. But Victoria's work outside Serenity Hills was accelerating. She returned to the hotel where our wedding reception had been held, using the key card for the honeymoon suite that she'd taken from my clutch. Hotel staff saw her enter, saw a woman who looked exactly like the bride, and assumed nothing was amiss. Why wouldn't Grace Hayes return to her own honeymoon suite? Inside, Victoria photographed everything in the safe with methodical precision. Every page of my passport, front and back. My social security card from multiple angles. Each credit card. The financial documents I'd foolishly stored there. Bank statements, investment account summaries, the deed to my Portland condo held under the LLC. She sat at the suite's desk and called Nathan, reading him account numbers, routing information, security questions, and answers I'd written down for Michael in case of emergency. Nathan was already at his computer using the information to systematically breach my digital life. Password reset for my primary email. Security questions, mother's maiden name first, pet's name, city where I was born. All information Victoria knew. The reset email went to a new account Nathan had created, one Victoria now controlled. From the email account, they accessed everything else. Password resets for my banking apps, my investment accounts, my business email for Grace, Eleanor Consulting. They moved carefully, changing passwords one by one, verifying access before moving to the next target. Nathan began the transfer process cautiously. First, small amounts, $500 from checking to a new account he'd opened, testing whether the transaction would trigger fraud alerts. When nothing happened, he tried 1,000, then 2,000. Each successful transfer emboldened them further. Victoria spent hours in front of mirrors perfecting my mannerisms. She recorded herself speaking, adjusting her voice to match my slightly lower pitch, my careful enunciation. She practiced my signature, obsessively signing my name hundreds of times until the muscle memory became automatic. She raided my closet, systematically taking my clothes to her apartment and photographing herself in each outfit, creating a visual reference guide. She studied my makeup routine, my skincare products, the specific way I lined my eyes and applied lipstick. Meanwhile, Michael was drowning in guilt and confusion. His wife's twin sister was in a psychiatric facility. His wife was distant and strange, and his wedding night had become a nightmare. When he tried to talk to Victoria, believing her to be me about what had happened, she'd deflect with perfectly calibrated emotion. "I can't talk about this right now," she'd say, voice trembling. "Every time I close my eyes, I see Victoria collapsing. I feel so guilty, Michael. I should have known she was struggling. I should have seen the signs instead of being so wrapped up in wedding planning." Michael, conditioned by a lifetime of healthy family dynamics to believe that people generally tell the truth, especially about serious matters, tried to comfort her. "This isn't your fault. You couldn't have known. I'm her sister, her twin. I should have known." Victoria would let tears fall and Michael would hold her, and the intimacy she'd been avoiding became reimagined as shared grief. When Michael noticed inconsistencies, the way she held her fork differently, how she'd forgotten his mother's middle name in conversation, the fact that she suddenly liked her coffee with more sugar, Victoria had ready explanations. "You seem different," Michael ventured carefully one evening. "Of course I'm different," Victoria snapped with just the right amount of defensive hurt. "My sister is in a psychiatric hospital because I missed the warning signs. I'm traumatized, Michael. I'm barely holding it together. I'm sorry if I'm not being the perfect wife right now." Michael immediately backpedaled, apologizing for being insensitive, for not understanding the depth of her trauma. Victoria had identified his greatest weakness, his essential decency, his desire to support rather than challenge, and weaponized it expertly. She avoided physical intimacy beyond brief hugs and hand-holding, claiming she was too emotionally devastated. "I know we should be on our honeymoon right now," she'd say, "but I can't even think about that while Victoria is suffering. Can we please just postpone everything until she's stable?" Michael, guilty about wanting his honeymoon while his sister-in-law was institutionalized, agreed to everything. They canceled the Bali trip. Victoria moved into my apartment, our apartment, claiming she couldn't bear to be alone. And every night while Michael slept in our bed, Victoria lay awake studying the details of my life she'd photographed, memorized, stolen. By the end of the first week, Victoria had access to my email accounts, my banking passwords, my social security number, my passport, and my home. She'd transferred over $40,000 in small increments that hadn't triggered any alerts. She'd convinced Michael that his wife was traumatized and grieving, buying herself time to perfect the impersonation. And I remained at Serenity Hills, trapped in a chemically induced fog, occasionally surfacing just enough to understand that something was catastrophically wrong before being pulled back under by another dose of sedatives administered by nurses who believed they were helping a severely ill patient recover. By the second week, the sedation schedule should have been tapering off. Standard medical protocol for a patient who'd experienced a drug reaction would involve gradually reducing sedatives, monitoring for stability, beginning psychiatric evaluation. But that's not what happened to me. Instead, Victoria arrived at Serenity Hills on day 8 with grave concern etched on her face, my face wearing my concerned expression. She met privately with Dr. Morrison, the psychiatrist assigned to my case, and painted a picture of escalating danger. "I'm worried about Victoria's delusions," she said, and I can imagine the performance because I'd seen her manipulate people my entire life. When she's conscious, she's insisting more and more aggressively that she's me, that I'm her. She's becoming hostile about it. This was true in a sense. During my brief moments of semi-consciousness, I had been trying desperately to communicate the truth. But my drugged, slurring protests that I was Grace Hayes, that my sister had done something terrible, only confirmed Victoria's fabricated narrative. Given her documented history of identity confusion and the intensity of this current episode, Victoria continued, "I think she needs more time under sedation before we attempt any real therapeutic intervention. Forcing her to confront reality too soon could cause a complete psychotic break." Dr. Morrison, reviewing the falsified medical records that showed years of psychiatric treatment, agreed. He had no reason to doubt the concerned sister who was paying bills promptly and whose story matched the documentation. The medical notes from my supposed previous hospitalizations described a patient prone to identity delusions during stress, someone who required careful, gradual reintegration after episodes. "We'll continue the current protocol for another week," he decided. "Keep her comfortable and stable. Once the acute phase passes, we can begin actual treatment. Victoria signed the authorization forms extending my therapeutic sedation another 7 days. She forged my signature, Grace's signature, without hesitation, the pen strokes perfect from weeks of practice. The facility administrator noted the authorization, relieved that the family was committed to long-term care. The daily fee of $2,000 was being paid from my own bank account money Victoria was now freely accessing. While I remained trapped in that twilight state, surfacing occasionally only to be pulled back under Nathan and Victoria were systematically dismantling my financial life. They'd moved beyond small test transfers. Nathan had used a corrupt notary, someone with significant debt and flexible morals, to authenticate a power of attorney document that was completely fraudulent. The document stated that Victoria Hayes, due to severe mental illness and incapacitation, granted her sister Grace Hayes full authority over her financial affairs. The legal sleight of hand was brilliant in its perversity. By using my name as the person in control and Victoria's name as the incapacitated person, they'd created a framework that appeared legitimate on paper while inverting our actual identities. Any bank or institution reviewing the documents would see a mentally ill woman whose sister was responsibly managing her affairs. With the power of attorney, Nathan began larger transfers, $20,000 from my primary investment account to an intermediate holding account, $30,000 from my retirement fund claiming early withdrawal due to medical emergency, $15,000 from the LLC account that held my Portland condo's rental income. They moved money through 3 or 4 accounts before ultimately transferring it to offshore institutions with strict privacy laws. Each intermediate step made the trail harder to follow, the funds harder to recover. Nathan handled the technical aspects, while Victoria provided signatures, authorization codes, answers to security questions. They also began liquidating some of my investment positions. Grace Hayes needs liquid assets for her sister's medical care became the explanation for financial advisors who questioned unusual activity. Victoria had researched enough about my portfolio to speak semi-intelligently about positions I held enough to seem like the legitimate account holder, making difficult but necessary decisions. The amounts were still below the thresholds that would trigger automatic fraud reviews, but they were accelerating. In week 2 alone, they transferred over $100,000. My carefully built financial security was being systematically stolen, and I had no way to stop it or even know it was happening. Meanwhile, Victoria faced a challenge she hadn't fully anticipated. Michael's patience with the lack of intimacy in their supposed marriage was wearing thin. 2 weeks after our wedding that had ended in catastrophe, Michael approached the subject carefully. They were in my apartment in my bedroom, and Victoria had been avoiding this moment through a carefully orchestrated series of excuses about trauma and stress. "Grace," Michael said gently, using my name while speaking to my sister. "I know you've been through something horrible. I'm not trying to pressure you, but we're married. I miss being close to you. I miss us." Victoria had prepared for this inevitability. She'd researched what she called the physical differences problem, the small scars, birthmarks, and bodily quirks that develop uniquely even in identical twins. She knew about some of them from our shared childhood, but others had developed after we'd stopped seeing each other naked in adolescence. She'd planned carefully, dim lighting, claiming exhaustion to keep the encounter brief, positioning herself strategically to hide potential discrepancies. But there was one scar she'd forgotten about, one I'd gotten at age 14 in a bicycle accident, a pale line on my inner left thigh where I'd torn skin on a pedal. Victoria didn't have that scar. The moment Michael's hand touched her thigh and paused, she knew. His fingers had found smooth skin where they expected to encounter that familiar raised line. "Your scar," Michael said, confusion in his voice. "From the bike accident. It's gone." Victoria's mind raced, her heart hammering against her ribs. This was the moment that could unravel everything. She felt panic rising but forced it down, forced herself to think. "Oh," she said, and she made her voice small, vulnerable. "I had scar revision surgery last year. Remember I told you about it?" She hadn't, because I hadn't. The scar had been a part of me, unremarkable and unremarked upon. You did? Michael's voice carried doubt. I don't remember you mentioning it. Victoria let tears come, real tears born of fear and desperation. I'm self-conscious about my body, Michael. I had it done, and I didn't make a big deal about it because I was embarrassed that I even cared about something so minor. And now you're making me feel terrible about it. The accusation worked. Michael immediately shifted to comfort mode, apologizing for his insensitivity, assuring her that he loved her body regardless. Victoria cried harder, using emotion to shut down further questions, and Michael held her and apologized repeatedly. But after he fell asleep, Victoria lay awake, terrified. The close call had shown her the fundamental problem with her plan. Prolonged impersonation carried too many risks. Every day increased the chance of Michael noticing some discrepancy, some detail she'd missed. Physical intimacy was a minefield of potential exposure. She needed to move to the next phase soon. She needed me transferred somewhere more isolated, more permanent. Somewhere I could be kept indefinitely without questions, while she solidified her claim to my identity completely. The fog in my mind began to thin on day 13. The sedation was still present, but something had shifted. Maybe they'd miscalculated a dose. Maybe my body had built up tolerance. Whatever the reason, consciousness began to claw its way back, more persistent than before. I opened my eyes to white walls and fluorescent lights. A hospital room, but not a regular hospital. Through the window I could see manicured grounds, high fences disguised as decorative garden features. A nurse entered and saw me awake. "Victoria," she said warmly. "You're with us. How are you feeling?" Victoria. She'd called me Victoria. I tried to speak, my voice hoarse and cracking. I'm Grace. Grace Hayes." The nurse's expression shifted to practice sympathy. "I know you believe that, honey. But you're Victoria. You're safe here at Serenity Hills. Your sister Grace has been so worried about you." And in that moment, as consciousness fully returned and I understood where I was and what name they were calling me, I realized the full horror of what Victoria had done. She hadn't just stolen my money or my identity, she'd erased me completely. And when I opened my eyes, I discovered I was no longer Grace Hayes. I'd been replaced, renamed, rewritten. I'd been erased. The panic that crashed over me was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. It wasn't the sharp fear of immediate danger. It was the slow, suffocating horror of understanding that I'd been systematically erased. My name, my identity, my very existence had been stolen, while I lay unconscious, unable to defend myself. "No," I said louder now, trying to sit up. The IV tugged at my arm. "You don't understand. I'm not Victoria. My name is Grace Hayes. I'm a financial consultant. I just got married 2 weeks ago. My husband is Michael Chen. I live in Portland. I own a condo under Hayes Investment Properties, LLC. The nurse pressed a call button, her smile never wavering, but her eyes showing increasing concern. "It's okay, Victoria. You're confused right now, which is completely normal given what you've been through. Let me get Dr. Morrison for you." "I'm not confused." My voice cracked with desperation. "Please just look at my ID, check my driver's license, call my employer. I can prove who I am." "Your sister has all your belongings," the nurse said gently, as though this explained everything. "She's keeping them safe for you." My sister. The words made my stomach turn. Victoria had thought of everything. Of course she'd taken my wallet, my phone, anything that could prove my identity. Without those things, I was just a woman in a hospital gown making claims that the medical staff had been primed to dismiss. Dr. Morrison arrived within minutes, a man in his 50s with kind eyes and a calm demeanor that I immediately recognized as his professional psychiatrist mode, the voice doctors use with patients they believe are delusional. "Victoria," he said, pulling up a chair beside my bed. "I'm Dr. Morrison. How are you feeling?" "My name is Grace," I said, forcing myself to speak slowly, clearly, to sound as rational as possible. "Grace Hayes. I was drugged at my wedding reception by my twin sister, Victoria. She's done something to me, stolen my identity somehow. I need you to contact my husband, Michael Chen. He's a software engineer. We were married on October 14th. Please just call him." Dr. Morrison made notes on his tablet, his expression neutral. "I understand you believe that, but Victoria, your sister Grace, has been very worried about you. She's provided us with extensive medical records showing that you've struggled with identity confusion before, particularly during periods of stress." Medical records. I felt the ground shifting beneath me. What medical records? I've never been treated for any psychiatric condition. He showed me his tablet. I saw my name, Victoria Hayes, at the top of a file. Below it, a fabricated history of hospitalizations, medication trials, therapy sessions, dates, doctors' names, diagnoses, all fake, all impossibly detailed, all designed to create a narrative of mental illness that I could never escape. These records show 3 previous admissions for acute psychiatric episodes, Dr. Morrison explained. Each time you experienced delusions about being someone else, usually your twin sister. The pattern suggests a dissociative disorder possibly linked to childhood trauma. "Those are forged!" I was shouting now, unable to control my voice. "I've never been to those hospitals. Call them and ask. They'll have no record of me." "Victoria, please try to stay calm. Getting agitated will only—" "Don't call me Victoria." I grabbed his arm, desperate. "I'm Grace. I can prove it. Ask me about my work. I advise tech startups on financial strategy. I helped a company called Neural Path through their Series B funding last year. I negotiated a deal with Sequoia Capital. Check my LinkedIn profile. Check Grace Hayes on LinkedIn. You'll see my photo, my work history, everything." Dr. Morrison gently removed my hand from his arm. These detailed false memories are actually quite common in severe dissociative disorders. Your mind has created an elaborate alternative identity as a coping mechanism. But Victoria, the woman you believe yourself to be, Grace Hayes, is actually your sister. She's been visiting you every day, deeply concerned about your well-being. The room tilted. Victoria had been visiting, playing the concerned sister, reinforcing the lie with every visit, every worried question about my condition. "I want my phone," I said. "I want to call my husband. That's my right, isn't it? To make a phone call?" Dr. Morrison hesitated. "We can arrange a call to your emergency contact. Let me check your file for the number." He scrolled through the tablet, then frowned slightly. "The number listed appears to be disconnected. Your sister mentioned you'd been having some financial difficulties and had to cancel your phone service. She said she'd help you set up a new one once you were feeling better." Of course the number was disconnected. Victoria had thought of every detail, cut off every avenue of escape. A social worker arrived next, a woman named Patricia Chen, no relation to Michael, just a cruel coincidence of names. She carried a folder thick with paperwork and wore the expression of someone who'd dealt with difficult patients before. "Victoria, I'm Patricia. I'm here to help you understand your current situation and your rights as a patient here at Serenity Hills." "I'm being held against my will," I said immediately. "I was drugged and brought here under false pretenses. This is kidnapping." Patricia opened her folder with practiced patience. "I understand you're upset, but let me explain the legal situation. You were admitted 13 days ago under an emergency psychiatric hold after experiencing a severe crisis at your sister's wedding reception. The initial 72-hour hold has been extended to 30 days based on medical assessment that you present a potential danger to yourself." She showed me documents, and seeing them made my blood run cold. Admission papers signed in my handwriting, except it wasn't my handwriting, it was Victoria's forgery of my signature. Medical evaluations describing a patient who'd arrived in acute psychotic crisis, claiming to be her twin sister showing signs of severe delusion and possible substance abuse. "Your sister Grace provided documentation of your psychiatric history," Patricia continued. "Given that history and your current presentation, the medical team determined that extended treatment was necessary for your safety." "My sister Grace," I said, my voice hollow, "is the one who should be in this room. She drugged me. She's stolen my identity. And you're helping her do it by keeping me here. Patricia made a note. I understand you believe that. But Victoria, I need you to understand something important. Recovery from dissociative disorders is possible, but it requires accepting treatment. The more you resist, the longer your recovery will take. The trap was perfect, elegant in its cruelty. Every word I spoke in my own defense became evidence of my delusion. Every fact I provided about my real life was catalogued as a complex, false memory. Every protest was documented as resistance to treatment. If I insisted I was Grace Hayes, I was delusional. If I provided details about my career, my marriage, my life, I was demonstrating the elaborate nature of my delusion. If I became emotional or angry, I was showing the psychiatric instability that justified my imprisonment. The only way out, they were telling me, was to admit I was Victoria. To accept that my entire life, my career, my marriage, my carefully built independence was a fantasy. To agree that I was the damaged twin, the troubled sister, the one who needed to be locked away for her own protection. I want to see my sister, I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. I want to see Grace, the woman you think is Grace. Dr. Morrison and Patricia exchanged glances. We can arrange that, Dr. Morrison said, though we'll need to monitor the visit carefully. Do you think you can remain calm? Yes, I lied, because I needed to see Victoria face to face. I needed to look into her eyes and understand how she could do this to me. I needed to know if there was any part of my sister left inside the monster who'd stolen my life. As they left to make arrangements, I lay back on the narrow hospital bed and stared at the ceiling. The window had bars disguised as decorative metalwork. The door locked from the outside. My clothes, my phone, my wallet, my identity, all taken. Victoria hadn't just stolen my life. She'd imprisoned me in her own. And with crushing, devastating clarity, I understood that this wasn't an impulsive act of jealousy or revenge. This was a carefully planned execution, and I was already dead to the world that mattered. The woman they thought was Grace Hayes was living my life, sleeping in my bed, accessing my money, wearing my name. And the real Grace Hayes was trapped in a locked room being called by her sister's name, with no way to prove who she really was. After Victoria's visit, after she'd laid out the full scope of her plan with such chilling clarity, I understood that waiting for someone inside these walls to believe me was suicide by hope. No one here would help me. They were all following protocols, doing their jobs, convinced by falsified records and Victoria's flawless performance that they were treating a genuinely ill patient. I had to escape. It was the only option left. I began observing everything with new focus. Serenity Hills operated on strict routines, and routines meant patterns, and patterns meant potential weaknesses. Medication rounds at 7 noon and 8. Shift changes at 3. Outdoor recreation for stable patients every afternoon at 2:30, weather permitting. The courtyard was my best chance. It was enclosed by a decorative iron fence that was actually quite high, 8 feet at least, but presented as garden architecture rather than a security barrier. Patients were escorted outside in small groups, supervised by 2 orderlies who positioned themselves at opposite ends of the space. On the 3rd day of observation, I noticed the maintenance gate. It was tucked behind a row of hedges on the east side used by groundskeepers to bring in equipment and remove debris. And crucially, I saw a worker prop it open with a rock while he made multiple trips to his truck carrying bags of mulch. The gate was unlocked during maintenance work. That was my window. I forced myself to play the model patient. When they brought medications, I swallowed them without protest, even though the sedatives made my thoughts fuzzy and slow. I participated in group therapy sessions, speaking in measured tones about feeling better and starting to understand my situation. I apologized to nurses for my earlier outbursts, claimed I was beginning to see that I might be confused. Dr. Morrison noted my improved affect during his rounds. Victoria seems to be responding to treatment, he told a nurse within my hearing. We might be able to reduce supervision levels soon. That was exactly what I needed. Less supervision meant more opportunity. On the 6th day after Victoria's visit, I was cleared for outdoor recreation. The autumn air was crisp, the courtyard dotted with benches and small garden beds, where patients could dig in dirt as therapeutic activity. 6 of us were escorted outside, accompanied by 2 orderlies, Marcus, who seemed relatively kind, and Denise, who was older and less attentive. I pretended to focus on planting bulbs in a raised bed, but my attention was fixed on the maintenance gate. Come on, I thought. Please let there be maintenance today. 20 minutes into recreation period, I heard the rumble of a truck engine. The groundskeeper's vehicle appeared on the service road beyond the fence. My heart hammered. He parked, opened the back, and began unloading bags of topsoil. Then he walked to the gate, unlocked it, and propped it open with a landscaping stone. This was it. My only chance. I needed a distraction. The other patients were scattered across the courtyard, an older woman feeding birds, 2 men playing checkers on a concrete table, a younger woman walking laps while talking to herself. I chose the woman feeding birds, positioning myself nearby. When the groundskeeper went back to his truck for another load, I moved. I stepped sideways quickly, deliberately catching my foot on the woman's shoe. She stumbled, her bag of birdseed flying open, scattering across the concrete. Birds erupted in a chaos of wings and cries. "Oh my God, I'm so sorry," I said loudly, dropping to my knees to help gather the seed. The woman was startled but unhurt, more focused on the birds than on me. Both orderlies turned toward the commotion. Marcus started walking over, concerned. "Everything okay?" "I tripped," the woman said, flustered. "The birds—" I stood and ran. My legs felt weak from days of limited movement and sedation, but adrenaline made up for it. I sprinted across the courtyard toward the hedge line, my hospital slippers slapping against concrete. Behind me I heard shouting, Marcus yelling my name, Denise calling for security. The gate was 30 feet away. 20, 15. I could see the service road beyond the groundskeeper's truck, freedom so close I could taste it. My hand closed on the metal gate handle. I pulled. Then 200 pounds of orderly slammed into me from behind. Marcus tackled me like a linebacker, and we both went down hard on the gravel. My palms scraped bloody, the air knocked from my lungs. "No!" I screamed, struggling against his grip. "You don't understand, I'm being held illegally. My name is Grace Hayes. I have rights. This is kidnapping." Marcus pinned my arms behind my back while Denise called for backup. More staff poured out of the building. I kept screaming, kept fighting, even as they hauled me to my feet. "I'm Grace Hayes. Call the police. I'm not Victoria. Check my fingerprints. Call my husband, Michael Chen. Please." They dragged me back inside, my feet barely touching the ground. I saw the other patients staring, frightened. I saw the groundskeeper watching with wide eyes. I saw the security camera mounted above the entrance, its red light blinking, recording everything. Recording what would look to any objective viewer exactly like what my falsified medical records predicted: a psychiatric patient in acute crisis, violent and delusional, attempting to flee treatment, presenting a danger to herself and others. They took me to a different room in a different wing. No window, reinforced door, a camera in the corner. They held me down while a nurse administered an injection, a heavy sedative that I felt spreading through my bloodstream like liquid darkness. "Please," I whispered as the drug took hold. "Please listen. I'm Grace. I'm Grace Hayes." But the faces above me were already blurring, and I heard Dr. Morrison's voice from somewhere far away. "Increase the Haldol, 1-to-1 supervision until further notice, and call her sister. Grace needs to know about this episode." Victoria arrived within the hour. I was only semi-conscious by then, but I heard her voice thick with manufactured tears. "Oh God, is she okay? Did she hurt herself?" "She attempted to escape during outdoor recreation," Dr. Morrison explained. "Became violent when staff intervened. We've moved her to a more secure room and increased her medications." "I'm so scared she's going to hurt herself," Victoria said, and I could picture her wringing her hands, looking appropriately distressed. "Maybe we need to consider longer-term placement, somewhere more equipped to handle this level of instability. Let's see how she responds to the new medication regimen first. But yes, if these episodes continue, we may need to discuss transfer to a higher security facility." Victoria signed authorization forms forging my signature, again approving enhanced restrictions. Enhanced observation. Enhanced sedation. Every word was another bar on my cage. When I fully regained consciousness hours later, there was a staff member sitting 3 feet from my bed watching me. Watching constantly. I had no privacy, no moments alone, no opportunity to think or plan without being observed. The escape attempt that was supposed to free me had instead provided perfect evidence that I was exactly what Victoria claimed dangerously unstable delusional a risk to myself and others. Every action I took to save myself became proof that I needed to be locked away, drugged, isolated, monitored every second. I finally understood the full genius of Victoria's trap. She didn't need to kill me anymore. She just needed to keep me here forgotten and disbelieved while she lived my life. And I realized with crushing clarity my only chance now required help from outside these walls. Someone had to believe me. Someone had to investigate. But who, and how could I reach them when I couldn't even reach the bathroom without supervision? The constant observation was meant to break me, I think. To make me feel so watched, so scrutinized, that I'd eventually give up and accept their version of reality. But instead, it forced me to become strategic in ways I'd never had to be before. The night shift nurse was different from the others. Her name tag read Sarah Chen, and unlike the day staff who performed their duties with efficient detachment, Sarah actually looked at me, not at a chart, not at symptoms, but at me as a person. She was in her mid-30s, I guessed, with intelligent eyes and a calm competence that came from years of experience. During her first shift, observing me, she brought a book, something about the Ottoman Empire, and read quietly in the chair beside my bed when I pretended to sleep. I watched her through barely open eyes, studying her the way she was supposed to be studying me. She made notes occasionally, but they were brief, perfunctory. Mostly, she just sat there present, but not intrusive, and something about her manner suggested she was actually thinking rather than just following protocols. On her second night, I spoke. "What are you reading?" She looked up slightly surprised. "A history of Constantinople's fall. Probably boring for most people." "I've always found the Byzantine Empire fascinating," I said carefully. "The way such a complex civilization could persist for so long and then collapse so completely." Sarah's expression shifted slightly, interest, maybe assessment. "Not many people know the difference between Byzantine and Ottoman. I minored in history," I said, which was true, "before I switched to finance." I saw her make a mental note of that. Finance. Not what my chart said Victoria's background was. Over the next few nights, I engaged Sarah in conversation whenever she worked. I was careful never to directly challenge my assigned identity, never to insist I was Grace. Instead, I demonstrated who I was through what I knew, what I could discuss, how I thought. We talked about books, current events, the recent tech IPOs, political developments, economic trends. I asked her opinion on things, listened to her responses, treated her as an intellectual equal rather than a jailer. Slowly, I saw her perception of me shift from delusional patient to intelligent person in distress. On the 5th night, I tried a different approach. "Can I ask you a hypothetical question?" Sarah set down her book. "Sure." "If someone really did steal another person's identity, like in a movie or something, how would the real person prove who they are? I mean, if the thief had their ID, their documents looked exactly like them. How would you prove you're you?" Sarah considered this thoughtfully. "That's a good question. I suppose you'd need to know things only you could know, intimate details, specific memories, or physical evidence, scars, birthmarks, things that can't be easily replicated. But if you tried to tell people the truth, they'd think you were crazy, wouldn't they? Especially if the person who stole your identity was trusted, seemed credible?" "They probably would," Sarah admitted. "It would be nearly impossible to prove." "Exactly," I said quietly. "A perfect crime." I saw something flicker across her face, not quite suspicion but curiosity. She was thinking. The next night, I mentioned something casually while we were talking about her husband's work in tech. I read about Neural Path's IPO last year. Interesting case study in Series B to public transition strategy. The way they structured their institutional investor outreach was really innovative. Sarah went very still. How do you know about that? That's pretty specialized knowledge. I follow financial news, I said with a shrug. Used to anyway. I found venture capital structuring fascinating. But I'd seen her reaction. Her husband worked at a tech company. She'd probably heard about Neural Path. And I'd just demonstrated knowledge that a woman with Victoria's background art history dropout, failed boutiques wouldn't have. I didn't push it. I just let it sit there, another small seed of doubt. 2 nights later, Victoria visited during Sarah's shift. I watched Sarah watch the interaction, seeing it through new eyes. Victoria brought a lavender sachet, claiming it was my favorite scent. Victoria always loved lavender, she told Sarah warmly. Even as a child, I thought it might comfort her. The smell made me nauseous. I'd always hated lavender, found it cloying and overwhelming. I turned my face away, and I saw Sarah notice both my reaction and Victoria's assertion. After Victoria left, Sarah was quieter than usual. I could practically see her mind working, cataloging inconsistencies. The breakthrough came on Sarah's 8th night shift. She'd been looking at something on her phone during a quiet moment, and I saw her glance at me, then back at her screen, then at me again. "Can I ask you something?" she said finally. "Of course." "You mentioned Neural Path's IPO. That deal was handled by a consultant named Grace Hayes. I looked her up, my husband mentioned that name once. There's a professional profile online." My heart began to race, but I kept my voice steady. "Is there... The woman in the photo looks exactly like you, and exactly like your sister." "We're identical twins," I said carefully. Sarah set down her phone and walked closer to my bed, studying my face with clinical attention. She reached out slowly, giving me time to object, and gently tilted my head to examine my left eyebrow. "You have a small scar here," she said. "A pale line maybe half an inch long. From a childhood injury." "I fell off a bike when I was 14, I whispered. "Caught my eyebrow on the handlebar." Sarah's expression changed. "Grace Hayes in that professional photo has the same scar. Same exact location." She paused. "Your sister, the woman who visits claiming to be Grace. I've never noticed that scar on her." The air between us felt electric with possibility and danger. "If you were going to check," I said very quietly, "you'd need to be subtle about it. If she knows someone is suspicious, she'll disappear. She's smart. She's been planning this for months." Sarah sat back down heavily in her chair. "You're saying your sister actually did steal your identity. This isn't a delusion. I'm saying that if someone wanted to investigate whether that was possible, they'd need to be very careful. They'd need evidence that can't be disputed. And they'd need to move quickly because every day I'm in here, she's transferring more of my money offshore." Sarah looked at me for a long moment, and I saw the exact instant she made her decision. I could lose my job for this. If I'm wrong, if I'm being manipulated by a patient with an elaborate delusional system, my career is over. "I know," I said, "and I can't promise you won't regret helping me, but Sarah, I'm telling you the truth. And I think you already know that." She stood up, checked the hallway to make sure no one was nearby, then turned back to me. "I'm going to do some research, quietly. I'm not making any promises, but I'm going to look into this." "Thank you," I breathed. "But Sarah, we don't have much time. My sister is planning something, I can feel it. She's going to move me somewhere more isolated soon, and once she does, no one will ever find me." Sarah's jaw tightened. "Then we'd better work fast." Sarah didn't work the next 2 nights. I spent those 48 hours in an agony of uncertainty, wondering if she'd changed her mind, if she'd reported our conversation to Dr. Morrison, if I'd just made everything worse by trusting her. The substitute nurses were professional but distant, and I felt the walls closing in again. When Sarah finally returned on the third night, she looked exhausted. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, and I could tell she hadn't been sleeping. She went through her initial rounds, quietly checking vitals and reviewing charts, but I could feel the tension radiating from her. Finally, after midnight when the hallways were quiet, she pulled her chair close to my bed and spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "I've spent the last 2 days thinking about this," she said. "I've researched, I've questioned my own judgment. I've considered every possibility that you could be exactly what your chart says. You are a patient with an elaborate delusional system. But there are too many things that don't add up." Hope flared in my chest, almost painful in its intensity. "You believe me." "I'm not saying I believe you yet," Sarah corrected carefully. "But I'm willing to investigate. Willing to listen. But Grace or Victoria or whoever you really are, you need to understand what I'm risking here. If I'm wrong, if I help a psychiatric patient act on delusions, I lose my nursing license. I lose my career. I could face legal consequences for violating patient care protocols." "I understand," I said. "And I'm telling you the truth. I can prove it, but I need your help to gather the evidence." Sarah pulled out a small notebook, her personal one, not the medical charts. "Okay, talk to me. Give me specific details that I can verify externally. Things that Victoria couldn't know or couldn't have learned through observation." I took a breath, organizing my thoughts. This was my one chance to convince her. "My employee ID number at Morrison Financial Consulting is MFC 2847. You can verify that through LinkedIn. My profile lists me as a senior consultant there. My direct supervisor is Margaret Yoshida. My work email is g.hayes@morrisonfc.com, but Victoria's probably already locked me out of that account." Sarah made notes. "What else?" "My private investment advisor is James Rothstein at Cascade Wealth Management in Portland. Victoria wouldn't know about him because I never told my family I had that kind of money to invest. His direct number is 503-555-7842. He'll have my account information, my signature on file, everything." "Keep going." "My condo is at 2847 Northwest Thurman Street in Portland, but it's held under an LLC called Hayes Investment Properties. The property records are public, but you'd have to know to look for the LLC connection. The mortgage is paid off. I bought it outright 3 years ago using a signing bonus from a major consulting contract." Sarah's pen moved quickly across the page. "These are good. What else?" 6 months ago, I consulted on a confidential project for a startup called Quantum Edge. They're developing quantum computing applications for financial modeling. The project hasn't been publicly announced yet. They're still in stealth mode before their Series A announcement. I can tell you specific details about their technology architecture, their funding strategy, their target investors. Victoria couldn't possibly know any of that." "And your relationship with Michael?" Sarah asked. "Your sister has been living with him. She'd know a lot of intimate details by now." "Our first date was at Powell's Books on Burnside, the used book section, 3rd floor, science fiction and fantasy. We spent 4 hours there and bought matching copies of Le Guin's The Dispossessed. Michael's mother's middle name is Eleanor, he told me on our 5th date when I mentioned it was my middle name too. That's not on social media anywhere. And we have a private joke about—" I paused, feeling exposed, but knowing I had to continue. "About hotel room service. On our first trip together, I ordered a grilled cheese sandwich at 2 in the morning, and Michael teased me that I had sophisticated tastes. Now, whenever we order room service, he always suggests grilled cheese first. Victoria wouldn't know that." Sarah looked up from her notes. "These are all things I can potentially verify. But Grace, I need you to understand, if you're lying to me, if this is an elaborate manipulation, I will not only stop helping you, I'll make sure you get the psychiatric treatment you actually need." "I know," I said, "and I'm not lying. Everything I've told you can be verified, just please be careful. If Victoria finds out someone is investigating, she'll run, or worse." Sarah tucked her notebook into her pocket. "Here's what we're going to do. You need to pretend to improve. Stop insisting on your identity. Participate in therapy. Seem to accept treatment. If we can get your observation level reduced, you'll have more freedom, and I'll have more opportunities to help you without raising suspicion. The medications, I started. I can help you palm some doses when I'm on shift, Sarah said quietly. Not all of them because they monitor for medication compliance, but enough to keep your mind clearer. You'll still need to appear somewhat sedated to avoid suspicion. What will you do? I'm going to make some careful inquiries. I'll try to verify the details you gave me, the employee ID, the investment advisor. I'll see if I can contact Michael, though I'll have to be subtle about it. And I'm going to try to get access to security footage from the hotel where your wedding was held. If Victoria really did drug you, there might be video evidence. That footage won't last forever, I said urgently. Hotels typically keep security recordings for 30 days, maybe 45. It's been over 2 weeks already. Then I'll move fast. Sarah stood up, checking the hallway again. But Grace, we have to be smart about this. I'll use my personal phone for any external contact, not the facilities. We'll communicate through normal conversation during my shifts, nothing that would raise flags if someone overheard. And you have to play your part perfectly. If Dr. Morrison thinks you're getting worse, he might increase your medications or move you to a more restrictive facility. The thought made my blood run cold. Victoria mentioned that during her last visit, moving me somewhere more isolated. Sarah's expression darkened. Then we need to work fast. Can you do this? Can you pretend to accept their version of reality while we gather evidence? I thought about everything I'd lost, everything Victoria had stolen. I thought about Michael living with my sister, believing she was his wife. I thought about my money being drained offshore, my identity being erased, my life being lived by someone else. Yes, I said firmly. I can do this, whatever it takes. Okay. Sarah moved back to her chair, resuming her normal position. Starting tomorrow, you're a model patient, compliant, cooperative, showing signs of improvement. Meanwhile, I'll start digging. Sarah, I said, and she looked at me. Thank you. You're risking everything to help me. I'm risking everything to find the truth, she corrected. There's a difference. Now get some rest. You're going to need to be convincing tomorrow. I closed my eyes, but I didn't sleep. I ran through the plan in my mind, rehearsing how I'd present myself to Dr. Morrison, what I'd say in therapy, how I'd convince them I was improving. What neither Sarah nor I knew was that Victoria had already set her next move in motion. While we were carefully planning our investigation, she was planning something far more permanent, something that would eliminate me as a threat once and for all. The window for my rescue was closing faster than either of us realized. While I spent my days playing the model patient, participating in group therapy, taking my medications with apparent compliance, showing Dr. Morrison the improvement he wanted to see, Victoria was across town, sitting in my apartment with Nathan Webb, planning the next phase of my erasure. I didn't know about this meeting until much later, when evidence surfaced during legal proceedings. But the timing was crucial. While Sarah was beginning her quiet investigation and I was carefully building my case for freedom, Victoria was working to ensure I'd never escape at all. Nathan arrived at my Portland condo, the home I'd bought with my own money, now occupied by my sister, carrying a leather portfolio filled with financial reports. According to the security footage that was eventually subpoenaed, he looked nervous, checking over his shoulder before Victoria let him in. They sat at my dining room table, the one I'd chosen carefully from an artisan furniture maker, and reviewed their progress like executives at a board meeting discussing quarterly earnings. "We've moved about $300,000 so far," Nathan said, spreading printouts across the table. "Small transfers, different accounts, nothing that's triggered fraud alerts. But Grace's total accessible assets are over $2 million. At this pace, it'll take months to transfer everything, and every day we wait increases the risk." Victoria, wearing my clothes and sitting in my chair, traced a finger along the financial statements. "What's the rush? Everything's working perfectly. Grace is locked up. Michael believes I'm his wife. Nobody suspects anything. The facility costs alone are eating $42,000 a month," Nathan countered. "Serenity Hills charges $2,000 a day, And the longer we keep Grace alive and imprisoned, the more chances there are for someone to ask questions. What if a family member visits? What if one of her colleagues wonders why she's been silent for weeks? "I'm handling Michael," Victoria said. "He's completely convinced. And Grace doesn't have close family, just our parents who think I'm Grace, and Grace is the crazy twin in treatment." Nathan shook his head. "You're getting comfortable. That's dangerous. We need to accelerate the timeline and create permanent legal protection." This was when Nathan revealed his personal stake in Grace's destruction, the detail that made him more than just a hired financial expert. He pulled out a file one he'd been keeping for 2 years containing documentation of his pursuit of Grace and her rejection. "2 years ago, your sister humiliated me," he said, his voice tight with old resentment. "I asked her out. She said no. I asked again more persistently because I thought she was playing hard to get. She reported me to my firm's HR department for harassment. Got a formal warning on my record. Cost me a promotion." "I remember you mentioning that," Victoria said. "She looked at me like I was nothing, like I was beneath her." Nathan's hand clenched on the file. "This isn't just about money for me. This is about watching Grace Hayes lose everything: her identity, her wealth, her freedom, her life. I want to see her completely destroyed." Victoria smiled. My smile twisted into something cold. "Then let's make sure she can never come back." Nathan laid out his plan for permanent conservatorship. With 3 weeks of medical documentation from Serenity Hills showing severe treatment-resistant psychotic disorder with dangerous delusions and escape attempts, they could petition the court for permanent guardianship over Victoria Hayes' affairs. "I know a judge," Nathan said. "Judge Patricia Reeves. She's sympathetic to family members dealing with mentally ill relatives. With the right presentation, you, as the devoted sister trying to help your twin medical experts testifying about Victoria's incurable condition, she'll grant the conservatorship." "And then?" Victoria asked. "And then you have complete legal control. You can transfer the rest of the assets without any time pressure. You can make decisions about Victoria's long-term care. You can move her to a cheaper facility somewhere more isolated where nobody knows her, where she'll never have visitors or advocates." Nathan paused, letting the implication hang in the air. "Or," he continued carefully, "you can ensure that Victoria's condition deteriorates. Psychiatric patients die in care all the time. Medication interactions, sudden health complications, even suicide despite supervision. It's tragic, but it happens." Victoria understood what he was suggesting. With permanent conservatorship and medical documentation showing severe mental illness, she could arrange for Victoria to die. No one would question it. The troubled twin, the one with the psychiatric history, finally succumbing to her demons. And once Victoria was dead, there would be no one left to challenge Victoria's claim to my identity. She would be Grace Hayes, completely permanently with death certificates and legal documentation to prove that Victoria Hayes had died in psychiatric care. "How long would the conservatorship process take?" Victoria asked. 2 to 3 weeks if we file immediately. I'll prepare the paperwork. You'll need to maintain your performance as concerned sister. Maybe visit Grace more frequently. Document how worried you are about her deteriorating condition. And the judge won't question the medical records. Why would she? They're from a respected facility, signed by licensed physicians. As far as anyone official knows, Victoria Hayes has a documented history of psychiatric problems and is currently experiencing a severe psychotic episode. The medical evidence supports everything we're claiming. Victoria stood, walked to my kitchen window, looked out at the view I'd earned through years of hard work. "Do it," she said. "File for conservatorship. And start looking into those isolated facilities you mentioned. Somewhere far from Portland. Somewhere no one will ever find her." Nathan gathered his papers, satisfied. "I'll have the petition filed by end of week. Once it's granted, we can move the remaining assets quickly and get Victoria transferred. After that," he shrugged, "after that, it's just a matter of time." They shook hands, partners in crime, both motivated by greed and revenge, both convinced their plan was foolproof. What neither of them knew was that while they were planning my permanent imprisonment and eventual death, Sarah was making phone calls from her personal cell phone verifying the details I'd given her. She'd already confirmed my employee ID at Morrison Financial Consulting. She'd found my investment advisor, James Rothstein, and was preparing to contact him. And she was working on getting access to the hotel security footage from my wedding night. The race was on, though I didn't know it yet. Sarah was working to prove I was Grace Hayes. Nathan was working to ensure Victoria's legal right to keep me imprisoned forever. And I was in the middle playing my role as an improving psychiatric patient, completely unaware that my window for rescue was closing faster than anyone realized. Victoria agreed to the conservatorship plan, confident in her victory, savoring her stolen life. She had no idea that across town, a night shift nurse was about to find evidence that would unravel everything. Time was running out for both sides. Sarah worked quickly over the next 4 days using her breaks and time before and after shifts to verify the details I'd given her. I watched her carefully during our brief interactions, trying to read whether she was finding what she needed without being able to ask directly. On her third shift since we'd made our plan, she gave me the smallest nod while checking my vitals, a signal we'd arranged. She'd found something. Confirmed something. My heart raced as I maintained my facade of calm improvement for the benefit of the cameras. Later, she would tell me everything she'd discovered, but in those moments, I only knew that she was building my case piece by piece. Sarah had called Morrison Financial Consulting from her personal phone, identifying herself as a benefits verification specialist from a healthcare provider. The receptionist had confirmed without hesitation that yes, Grace Hayes was employed, there had been for 7 years, was a senior consultant in good standing. When Sarah asked if there had been any recent changes to employment status, the receptionist said no, though they'd been trying to reach Ms. Hayes about an urgent client matter and she hadn't responded to emails in over 2 weeks, which was unusual. That detail had made Sarah's skin prickle. An employee who'd been unreachable for 2 weeks right around the time Victoria Hayes was admitted to psychiatric care. She'd traced the LLC that held my condo through public property records, finding Hayes Investment Properties, and the documents showing the property was owned free and clear, purchased for cash 3 years ago. The details matched exactly what I'd told her. But the most damning evidence came from Michael. Sarah had spent hours crafting the perfect message, one that wouldn't alarm him, but would get the information she needed. She'd created a throwaway email account and sent a carefully worded message. I'm a medical professional treating a patient who may have been the victim of identity fraud. For verification purposes only, could you describe any distinguishing physical features of your wife, Grace Hayes, scars, birthmarks, etc.? This information is needed for a confidential investigation. Michael had responded within hours, clearly confused but willing to help. He'd described the small scar on my left eyebrow from the childhood bike accident. He'd mentioned a birthmark on my left shoulder blade shaped like a comma. He'd noted a small mole behind my right ear. Sarah had checked. I had all 3 marks in exactly the locations Michael described, and she'd observed carefully during Victoria's visits the woman claiming to be Grace Hayes had none of them. That's when Sarah knew with absolute certainty that she was helping the right person. But it was also when she made the mistake that would cost her everything. She'd tried to access the facility's security footage, hoping to document the physical differences between me and Victoria. But Serenity Hills had upgraded its security system recently, and unusual access requests, especially to archived footage, triggered automatic alerts to the administrator's office. Gerald Hutchins, already nervous about his arrangement with Nathan and concerned about liability, immediately called the patient's primary family contact when he saw that a nurse had attempted to access security recordings. Victoria was in my apartment going through my closet to decide which of my clothes to donate, removing evidence of my existence piece by piece when her phone rang. Miss Hayes, this is Gerald Hutchins from Serenity Hills. I'm calling because we've had some unusual activity regarding your sister's care that I thought you should know about. Victoria's hand froze on one of my blazers. What kind of activity? One of our nurses, Sarah Chen, has been accessing your sister's files outside her normal duties. And she attempted to access our security footage archives, which is highly irregular. I wanted to make you aware in case there's a concern about patient privacy or staff conduct. Victoria's mind raced. A nurse investigating, accessing files, looking at security footage. This was a threat she hadn't anticipated. Sarah Chen. Victoria's voice took on a trembling quality. Oh my God, I've been worried about her. She's been acting strangely during her visits with Victoria, very focused on her asking unusual questions, making what seemed like promises about release. That's concerning, Hutchins said, alarm creeping into his voice. I didn't want to say anything because I know staff shortages are difficult, but Mr. Hutchins, I think Sarah might be... I don't know, maybe she's being manipulated by Victoria's delusions. Victoria can be very convincing when she's having an episode. She might have convinced Sarah that the delusions are real. Victoria was already planning her attack, building the narrative in real time. Within 2 hours, she'd filed a formal written complaint. Within 4 hours, she'd delivered edited recordings to Hutchins' office, recordings she'd made during her visits to me, where I insisted I was Grace, claiming my sister had stolen my identity. Victoria had edited them carefully, removing context, making it seem like I was manipulating staff with elaborate false claims. I'm worried about Sarah, Victoria told Hutchins, tears in her eyes, my eyes used as weapons. She seems to genuinely believe Victoria's story. But I've seen this before with my sister. She's very intelligent, very convincing, and when she's having a delusional episode, she can make you believe anything. I think Sarah needs help too, honestly. This level of susceptibility to patient manipulation suggests she might have her own vulnerabilities. The implication was clear. Sarah was either dangerously incompetent or psychologically unstable herself. Hutchins, already compromised by his arrangement with Nathan and terrified of liability, moved swiftly. Sarah was called into his office the next morning and informed that she was suspended pending investigation of serious allegations regarding patient care boundaries. You're accused of inappropriate involvement with a patient, Hutchins said. Accessing files without authorization, making unauthorized promises about release, and potentially being manipulated by a patient's delusional system. That's insane, Sarah protested. I was investigating because I have evidence that the patient is telling the truth. Grace Hayes is... You're proving the point right now, Hutchins interrupted. You've become convinced by the patient's delusions. You're banned from any contact with Victoria Hayes effective immediately, and if you attempt to interfere further, you'll face termination and potential legal action for violating patient confidentiality. Sarah tried to argue, tried to present her evidence, but Hutchins wouldn't listen. The facility's lawyer had already advised him that a wealthy family's complaint against a nurse could result in lawsuits, bad publicity, licensing issues. It was safer to remove Sarah than to investigate her claims. I didn't know any of this had happened until Sarah's usual shift came and a different nurse arrived. Then another night passed. And another. On the third night, I asked the substitute nurse where Sarah was. Nurse Chen is no longer assigned to your care, she said tersely, and something in her tone told me not to push. My ally was gone. My only hope of rescue had been neutralized. And Victoria, now fully alert to the danger, was planning her final solution to the Grace problem. When the fourth night passed without Sarah, I knew she wasn't coming back. The substitute nurse who'd taken over my care was professional but cold, going through motions without the careful attention Sarah had shown. She didn't meet my eyes. She didn't engage in conversation beyond medical necessity. Where is Nurse Chen? I asked on the fifth night, keeping my voice casual. Nurse Chen is no longer assigned to your care, she said, and something in her clipped tone told me Sarah had been more than reassigned. She'd been removed, possibly fired, certainly silenced. My heart sank. Victoria had found out somehow. She'd moved against Sarah the same way she'd moved against me, swiftly, strategically, using the system against anyone who questioned her narrative. I was alone again, except this time, it was worse. Victoria now knew someone had been investigating. She'd be more careful, more paranoid, and she'd likely accelerate whatever she had planned for me before anyone else could start asking questions. I lay in the narrow bed that night, fighting against the fog of medication, forcing my mind to work through the despair. Sarah had been my hope, but I couldn't afford to give up. I had to think. I had to find another way. What evidence existed that could prove what Victoria had done? Evidence she couldn't control or destroy. Evidence that existed outside these walls beyond her reach. And then, through the chemical haze, I remembered security cameras. The hotel where we'd held the wedding reception, the Riverside Grand, was a high-end venue. They would have comprehensive security coverage, cameras in the ballroom, the hallways, the elevator lobbies. They might have footage of Victoria near my champagne glass. They would definitely have footage of her helping me to the elevator, taking me upstairs when I was drugged. My pulse quickened. That footage could prove Victoria had drugged me. It could show her taking me to the honeymoon suite when I was incapacitated. It was objective evidence that couldn't be dismissed as delusion. But hotels didn't keep security footage indefinitely. I'd learned this during a consulting project for a hospitality client. Standard retention was 30 to 45 days unless there was a specific incident requiring preservation. After that, the files were automatically overwritten to save storage space. I did the mental math counting back from today. The wedding had been, I struggled to keep track of time in this place where days blurred together, approximately 17 days ago, 18. That meant the footage might still exist, but the window was closing. I might have 2 weeks, maybe 3 at most, before it was gone forever. I needed someone to contact the hotel to request preservation of that footage before it was erased. But I had no phone privileges. My letters were screened by staff who believed I was delusional. Sarah was gone. I needed a new ally, and I needed to be smarter this time. Marcus worked the day shift as an orderly, usually handling patient transport and supervision during activities. He was younger than most staff, maybe mid-20s, with an earnest manner and kind eyes. I'd heard him mention to another orderly that he was working at Serenity Hills to pay for law school. He attended classes in the evenings and worked here during the day. Law school. That detail gave me an idea. I started building rapport slowly, carefully. During his shifts when he was assigned to my wing, I engaged him in normal conversation. Not about my situation, not about my identity, just regular human interaction. "How are your classes going?" I asked one afternoon when he was restocking supplies in my room. He looked surprised that I'd remembered. "Tough. Constitutional law is kicking my butt." "That's a hard class," I said. "All those Supreme Court precedents to memorize. Have you gotten to Marbury vs. Madison yet?" His eyebrows rose. "You know constitutional law?" "I took a few law classes as electives in college, found it fascinating. What aspect of law are you interested in?" Over the next several days, I established myself as intelligent, rational, genuinely interested in his goals. I asked thoughtful questions about his studies. I shared relevant knowledge without showing off. I was kind to other staff when he was present, demonstrating that I wasn't manipulative or difficult. Slowly, I watched his perception of me shift from psychiatric patient to educated woman who seems perfectly lucid. On the 8th day after Sarah's disappearance, I made my move. "Marcus, can I ask you for some advice? Legal advice." He paused in adjusting my medication schedule on the wall chart. "I'm not a lawyer yet, not even close." "I know, but you have access to legal resources I don't. I'm worried about my rights here as a patient, specifically about conservatorship laws." "Conservatorship?" He pulled up a chair, interested now. This was his field of study. "The staff mentioned that my sister has some kind of legal authority over my care. I'm trying to understand what that means. Whether there's paperwork filed with the court, what my rights are, whether I can challenge it." I kept my tone rational, curious rather than desperate. Just a patient trying to understand her legal situation. "Conservatorships have to be filed with the county court," Marcus said. "They're public record. There's a whole process, petitions, hearings, medical testimony." "Could you check for me?" I asked. "Using your law school library access. Just search the county court records to see if there's a conservatorship petition filed for Victoria Hayes. I want to understand what legal authority my sister actually has. It was a reasonable request. Law students researched court records all the time. It was related to his studies. It seemed completely innocent. Marcus considered this. I mean, court records are public. I don't see why I couldn't look. What county? Multnomah County, Oregon. I provided the specific courthouse information, the details of what he should search for. I can check tomorrow, he said. I have a research session at the law library anyway. It's just a database search. Thank you, Marcus. I really appreciate it. I just want to understand my legal situation. He left thinking he was doing a simple favor for a patient trying to understand her rights. What Marcus would discover when he searched those records would be the first crack in Victoria's perfect crime. There was no conservatorship petition, no filing, no legal authority granted through any court. Because Victoria and Nathan hadn't filed yet, they were still preparing the paperwork, still building their case. And that absence of documentation would be the proof I needed that something was very, very wrong. Marcus appeared during afternoon activities 2 days later. I was in the common room pretending to read a magazine while anxiety gnawed at my insides. When he caught my eye and gave a small, significant nod, my heart leaped. He waited until the other orderly was distracted, then sat beside me on the couch, speaking quietly. I checked the court records like you asked, he said. There's nothing there. No conservatorship petition for Victoria Hayes, no guardianship filing, nothing. I kept my expression carefully neutral, though relief and vindication surged through me. Are you sure? Could it be filed under a different name or county? I checked variations. Victoria Hayes Grace. Hayes different spellings. I even checked surrounding counties in case there was jurisdiction confusion. There's no conservatorship on file anywhere. But that doesn't make sense, I said, pitching my voice with confusion rather than accusation. The facility told me my sister has legal authority over my care through a conservatorship. How can that be if there's no court filing? Marcus's expression was troubled. It can't be. Conservatorships are court proceedings. They require petitions, hearings, judicial orders. They're public record. If your sister has been telling the facility she has conservatorship but there's no actual court documentation, then either there's been a terrible mistake, I said carefully, or something fraudulent is happening. I watched him process this, saw the moment his law school ethics kicked in. False imprisonment, fraudulent documentation. These were serious crimes and he'd stumbled into potential evidence of them. Marcus, I need you to make a phone call. Just one call. To the police non-emergency line. Tell them you work at a psychiatric facility where a patient appears to be held under fraudulent conservatorship documentation. Ask them to verify the legal authority for my commitment here. That's a serious accusation, he said, but his tone suggested he was already considering it. I'm not accusing anyone of anything, I said. I'm asking you to help verify that everything is legal and proper. If there's been a mistake, it should be corrected. If there's fraud, it should be investigated. Either way, you'd be doing the right thing. Marcus looked at me for a long moment. You're not what your chart says you are you? I'm a woman who's been locked in a psychiatric facility for 3 weeks with no clear legal authority, I said. And I'm asking someone who's studying to be a lawyer to help ensure the law is being followed. That's all. He nodded slowly. Okay, I'll make the call. Marcus used his personal phone during his lunch break, standing in the parking lot where no one from the facility could overhear. He called the non-emergency police line for Multnomah County and explained the situation. He was an employee at a psychiatric facility. He'd discovered discrepancies in legal documentation. He was concerned about a patient's rights. The officer who took the call listened carefully. Elder abuse and psychiatric patient abuse were serious matters. False imprisonment was a felony. The officer took down the facility's name, the patient's name, and Marcus's contact information. We'll look into this, the officer said. We'll contact the facility and request documentation of the legal authority for this patient's commitment. The investigation moved through official channels with bureaucratic slowness, but it moved. 2 days later, a detective called Serenity Hills and spoke to Gerald Hutchins requesting copies of the conservatorship orders authorizing Victoria Hayes' commitment and medical decisions. Hutchins felt the first flutter of real fear. He pulled the files Victoria had provided, notarized documents, medical authorizations, pages of official-looking paperwork. But as he reviewed them with the facility's attorney on speakerphone, he realized none of them referenced specific court case numbers or judicial orders. "These documents are notarized," the attorney said carefully, "but they're not court-issued conservatorship orders. Mr. Hutchins, has a conservatorship actually been granted by a judge? I assumed the family provided documentation. I thought everything was in order. You need to contact the patient's family immediately and get clarity on the legal status of this commitment. If there's no valid conservatorship and the patient is being held involuntarily without proper legal authority, the facility has massive liability exposure." Hutchins, sweating now, called the number on file for Grace Hayes, the number that connected to Victoria's phone. Victoria was in my Portland condo, sorting through my jewelry, deciding what to keep and what to sell when her phone rang. The caller ID showed Serenity Hills. "Ms. Hayes, this is Gerald Hutchins. We have a situation that requires your immediate attention. The police have contacted us asking to verify the conservatorship documentation for your sister's commitment, and our attorney has questions about the legal status of the paperwork you provided." Victoria's blood went cold. The police? Why would the police be involved? Apparently, someone raised concerns about irregularities in the legal documentation. "We need clarification on the conservatorship status. Can you provide the court case number for the conservatorship order?" I'll need to find those documents. Can I call you back?" Victoria ended the call and immediately dialed Nathan, her hands shaking. "They know," she said without preamble. "The police are asking questions. The facility wants court case numbers we don't have. Nathan, they're going to figure out the conservatorship was never filed." "Fuck." Nathan's voice was tight. Okay, we need to move fast. We have 2 options: transfer Grace to a different facility out of state before they can investigate further, or we eliminate the problem permanently." "Eliminate?" Victoria's voice was barely a whisper. "Listen to me," Nathan said, his tone hard. "If Grace talks to the police, if she tells them her version of events, we're both going to prison. Identity theft, fraud, false imprisonment, attempted murder if they figure out the drugs, we're talking decades in prison. The only way we're safe is if Grace can't talk." "You want me to kill her?" "I'm saying patient deaths happen in psychiatric facilities. Suicide despite supervision, medication reactions, sudden health complications. It's tragic, but not unheard of. With her documented psychiatric history and recent escape attempt, no one would be shocked if Victoria Hayes took her own life." Victoria paced my living room, wearing my clothes, living my life, and for the first time since this began, she felt genuine fear. "I don't know if I can—" "Then you'd better figure it out fast," Nathan interrupted. "Because in 48 hours, maybe less, someone is going to start asking Grace questions directly. And once she talks, we're done. This only works if she's permanently silent." Victoria made her decision. "I'll go to the facility tomorrow. I'll figure something out." Back at Serenity Hills, I sensed the change before I understood it. Staff members whispered in hallways. Hutchins made unusual rounds, his expression worried. Marcus avoided eye contact, which told me his call had sparked something. Then Victoria arrived earlier than her usual visiting time, moving with urgent purpose. I saw her through the window of the common room, talking intensely with Dr. Morrison and Hutchins. Her body language was wrong, tense, agitated, not the concerned sister performance she usually delivered. When she looked toward the common room and our eyes met across the distance, I saw something in her face that made my stomach drop. Not triumph anymore, not satisfaction, desperation, and determination. Grace has to disappear completely, I imagined her thinking. And I knew with absolute certainty that my time had run out. The atmosphere at Serenity Hills changed overnight. Staff members who'd been routine in their interactions suddenly treated me with extra caution, as though I were made of glass or explosives. something fragile and dangerous simultaneously. I caught fragments of hushed conversations outside my door. Legal issues with the documentation. Police might be asking questions. Family meeting scheduled. Something had shifted, and the shift felt dangerous. Victoria arrived the next afternoon without her usual advance notice. I watched through the common room window as she spoke with Dr. Morrison and Hutchins, her gestures sharp and urgent. Gone was the performance of the concerned, devoted sister. This was something rawer, more desperate. When she entered the visiting room where I'd been brought, she smiled for the benefit of the orderly stationed by the door. But when she sat across from me, the smile died. "How are you feeling today, Victoria?" she asked, her voice carrying to the orderly. Then, leaning forward as if to adjust a pillow behind me, she whispered so quietly only I could hear, "I'm sorry it has to end this way. If you just stayed quiet, I might have let you live in here forever. But you couldn't stop fighting, could you?" My blood turned to ice. The threat was unmistakable. Not imprisonment anymore, elimination. "I've been thinking about your long-term care," Victoria continued at normal volume for the orderly's benefit. "Dr. Morrison and I agree you need a more specialized facility. We're making arrangements for a transfer." A transfer? To somewhere more isolated? Somewhere Victoria had more control? Or maybe there wouldn't be a transfer at all. Maybe I'd simply have an unfortunate accident before any transfer could happen. Victoria stayed 15 minutes playing her role perfectly, then left. I sat in the visiting room, my mind racing. I had maybe 24 hours, possibly less, before Victoria acted. The police investigation Marcus had triggered would take days to develop. I didn't have days. I had to escape. Tonight. Tomorrow at the latest. But how? After my first failed attempt, security had been increased. I was watched constantly. The facility's exits were monitored. The fence was high and topped with decorative spikes. The answer came the next morning during the staff briefing I overheard while being escorted to breakfast. "Reminder quarterly evacuation drill is scheduled for 2 p.m. today. All staff review emergency protocols." An evacuation drill. Controlled chaos. Patients moved outside, staff focused on following procedures rather than watching individual people. It might be my only chance. I saw Marcus during lunch. He was avoiding direct eye contact, clearly wrestling with what he'd set in motion. But when he brought my tray, he leaned close and whispered, "The drill is at 2. When we're outside, if you need help, I'll do what I can." At exactly 2 p.m., the fire alarm sounded. Staff moved efficiently, guiding patients toward exits according to the drill protocol. We were herded outside to the designated assembly area on the east lawn, orderlies counting heads and checking names against rosters. The confusion was less than I'd hoped. Serenity Hills had clearly practiced this, but there was enough distraction. Staff members focused on their assigned duties, on making sure procedures were followed correctly, on demonstrating compliance with safety regulations. Marcus positioned himself near me as we stood in the organized chaos of 40 patients and 20 staff members. He moved closer, and I felt something press into my palm, his phone small and warm. 3 minutes max, he breathed. Then I need it back or they'll notice. My hands were shaking as I turned away from the group, pretending to adjust my hospital gown while shielding the phone with my body. I dialed Michael's number from memory, my fingers clumsy with adrenaline. It rang and rang, then voicemail. "Michael, this is Grace, your real wife. I'm at Serenity Hills Psychiatric Facility, 40 miles outside Portland. Victoria drugged me at our wedding, switched our identities. I'm imprisoned here under her name. There's security footage at the hotel from our wedding, get it before it's erased. I'm in danger. Please, you have to believe me. Check my eyebrow scar. Victoria doesn't have it. I love you. Help me." My voice cracked on the last words. Then I dialed 911. "I'm being held illegally at Serenity Hills Psychiatric Facility. My name is Grace Hayes, but I'm registered under Victoria Hayes. This is false imprisonment. Please send help." I gave the address, ignored the dispatcher's questions, ended the call. Deleted both calls from the log. slipped the phone back to Marcus, who pocketed it smoothly. But calling wasn't enough. Victoria could act before help arrived. I needed to escape now while I had the chance. I scanned the grounds. The assembly area was near the service entrance where delivery trucks occasionally pulled in. And there, a white laundry truck was parked at the loading dock. Its back doors opened the driver inside the building checking paperwork. This was it. My only chance. I waited until an orderly was helping an elderly patient who'd stumbled until attention was fractionally diverted. Then I bolted. "Hey!" someone shouted behind me, but I was already running, my bare feet slapping against concrete. The hospital gown flapped around my legs. I heard shouts, footsteps pursuing, but adrenaline made me faster than I'd been in weeks. 30 feet to the truck. 20. 15. An orderly was closing in from my left. I pushed harder, lungs burning. I reached the truck and scrambled into the back, diving into a pile of clean linens. I burrowed deep, pulling white sheets over myself, trying to still my gasping breaths. Footsteps thundered nearby. Where did she go? Check the grounds. She can't have gotten far. I heard them running past the truck, fanning out to search. I stayed perfectly still under the linens, every muscle tensed, waiting to be discovered. Then the driver's voice annoyed. "What's all the commotion?" "Patient escape. Did you see anyone?" "No. I've been inside getting signatures. You want me to wait while you search?" No, go ahead. She's probably hiding in the bushes somewhere." The truck's back doors slammed shut, plunging me into darkness. The engine started. The vehicle began to move. I was escaping. Actually, escaping. But I was barefoot, wearing a hospital gown with no money, no ID, no phone. Every law enforcement agency in the area would soon be looking for an escaped psychiatric patient. Victoria would be notified immediately. She'd be searching for me, too desperate to silence me before I could tell my story. I had to get to Michael, or to the police, or to anyone who would believe me before Victoria found me first. The truck rumbled down the road, carrying me toward freedom, or toward the final confrontation with my sister. Across town in a conference room at his tech company, Michael felt his phone buzz. He ignored it. He was in an important meeting, but during the break he checked his messages and saw the voicemail from an unknown number. He pressed play and heard his wife's voice, except it didn't quite sound like the woman he'd been living with. It sounded like Grace used to sound before the wedding, before everything changed. "Michael, this is Grace. Your real wife." His hand began to shake as he listened to words that made no sense, that couldn't possibly be true, that shattered everything he thought he knew about the last 3 weeks of his life. The laundry truck stopped at a red light about 2 miles from Serenity Hills, and I knew this might be my only chance to exit without being seen. I pushed aside the linens covering me, found the truck's interior release handle, and when the light turned green and the driver accelerated, I opened the door and dropped onto the pavement. I hit the ground hard, rolling on the shoulder of the road, my bare feet scraping against gravel. The truck continued on, the driver oblivious. I scrambled into a row of bushes bordering a strip mall parking lot and crouched there shaking. I was free, but I was also barefoot, wearing a thin hospital gown in 40-degree weather, with no money, no phone, no identification. And within minutes, every police unit in the area would be looking for an escaped psychiatric patient. I needed to get to Michael, or to a police station where I could explain everything before Victoria could spin another lie. But I didn't even know where I was. The strip mall looked vaguely familiar. Maybe I'd driven past it before, but I couldn't orient myself. I stayed hidden in the bushes, trying to think through the fog of fear and cold. My feet were already going numb. A woman walking toward the strip mall's coffee shop gave me a strange look, and I realized how I must appear, wild-eyed, hospital-gowned, clearly in distress. I couldn't stay here. I'd be reported within minutes. I moved through the parking lot, staying low between cars, and found a gym near the end of the strip mall. The back entrance had a small alcove with a dumpster that provided cover. I huddled there, trying to decide my next move. That's when I heard sirens in the distance. Multiple vehicles converging from different directions. Whether they were looking for me or responding to some other emergency, I couldn't know, but I pressed deeper into the shadows. What I didn't know, what I couldn't know as I shivered in that alcove, was that across town Michael was listening to my voicemail for the third time, his face pale with shock. He'd left his meeting, ignored his colleagues' questions, and was now sitting in his car in the parking garage trying to process what he'd heard. The voice on the message was his wife's voice, except it wasn't the woman he'd been living with. It had Grace's cadence from before the wedding, her way of emphasizing certain words, the slight breathlessness she got when stressed. "Check my eyebrow scar. Victoria doesn't have it." Michael's hand went to his own eyebrow unconsciously. He'd touched Grace's scar 1,000 times. Small, pale-shaped like a crescent on her left eyebrow from a childhood bike accident. He knew it intimately. But when he thought back over the past 3 weeks trying to recall if he'd seen that scar on the woman he'd been living with, he realized he couldn't remember noticing it. She'd been wearing more makeup than usual, different hairstyles that covered her forehead more, small changes he'd attributed to stress about her sister's breakdown. His mind raced through other inconsistencies, the way she'd forgotten his mother's middle name, how she'd held her coffee cup differently, the missing scar on her inner thigh that she'd explained away with a lie about scar revision surgery he'd never heard about before. Michael started his car and drove toward Serenity Hills, breaking multiple speed limits. I didn't know any of this. I only knew I was freezing and terrified and completely alone. A delivery driver arrived at the gym, propping open the back door while he unloaded boxes. I saw my opportunity. When his back was turned, I slipped inside, moving quickly through a storage room and into the gym's locker area. A staff locker was partially open. Inside, I found a hoodie and sweatpants, someone's workout clothes. I pulled them on with shaking hands, the fabric rough against my skin but gloriously warm. There were flip-flops on the floor of the locker, too big but better than barefoot. I found a back exit that led to a different street and emerged looking marginally less like an escaped mental patient. Still no money, still no phone, but at least I wouldn't die of exposure. I started walking in what I hoped was the direction of the facility. If Michael got my message, that's where he'd go. I had to get there, had to intercept him before Victoria could twist the truth again. What I didn't know was that Michael had already arrived at Serenity Hills, that the facility was in chaos over my escape, that he was demanding to see patient records and making connections I'd desperately hoped he would make. The administrator had shown him my file, Victoria's file officially with my photograph, my physical description, my eyebrow scar documented in the intake notes. "This is my wife," Michael had said, his voice hollow. "This photograph is Grace Hayes, my wife." "No, sir," the administrator had corrected nervously. "This is Victoria Hayes. Your wife Grace has been visiting her regularly." Michael had called Victoria, then his hands steadying with cold fury. "There's an emergency with your sister. You need to come to the facility. Now." And Victoria, still unaware that I'd escaped, still believing she had time to solve the Grace problem, had driven to Serenity Hills, walked into the administrative building, and found Michael waiting with Dr. Morrison and a security guard. I was still 3 blocks away, hurrying down a side street when the confrontation happened. "Show me your left eyebrow," Michael had demanded. "The one with the scar." I learned all of this later, pieced together from Michael's testimony and security footage. But in that moment, I was just a woman in stolen clothes running toward an uncertain salvation, praying I'd reach my husband before my sister could destroy the last threads of truth. Victoria's face had gone white. She'd touched her eyebrow, smooth, unscarred, and known she was caught. As I turned onto the road leading to Serenity Hills, I saw police cars in the parking lot, their lights flashing. My heart seized. Was I too late? Had Victoria convinced them I was the dangerous one? I stood there 3 blocks away, cold and terrified, watching the facility's entrance, trying to decide whether to run toward my salvation or away from my doom. I stood on that corner watching the police cars, paralyzed by fear and indecision. If I walked into that facility, would they believe me or immediately restrain me as an escaped psychiatric patient? Victoria was in there. She'd have already started spinning her narrative, playing the worried sister, explaining away any inconsistencies. I needed Michael. I needed him to vouch for me to be on my side before I faced Victoria and the authorities. A woman was walking toward me on the sidewalk, returning from the gym with a yoga mat under her arm. I stepped into her path and she startled at my appearance. The too large hoodie, the hospital bracelet still on my wrist, that I'd forgotten to remove, the wild desperation in my eyes. "Please," I said, my voice breaking. "I need to borrow your phone, just one call. I escaped from somewhere dangerous and I need to reach my husband." She backed away, frightened. I can't. Please." I was begging now, tears streaming down my face. "My twin sister drugged me and had me committed to a psychiatric facility. She's been living my life for 3 weeks. I just escaped and I need to reach my husband before she convinces everyone I'm crazy. Please. My life depends on this." The woman stared at me, and I saw the moment she made her decision. Perhaps seeing something genuine in my desperation, perhaps simply willing to take a small risk to help someone in obvious distress. She handed me her phone. "One call. Then I'm calling the police myself if something seems wrong." "Thank you. Thank you." My hands shook as I dialed Michael's number. The digits burned into my memory from years of daily calls. He answered on the first ring. "Hello, Michael." His name came out as a sob. "It's Grace, your real wife. Did you get my voicemail? Grace." His voice broke on my name, and I heard everything in that single word: belief, anguish, rage. "Where are you? Are you safe?" "I'm 3 blocks from Serenity Hills. I escaped, but I have nothing. No ID, nothing. Michael, please tell me you believe me." "I'm at the facility right now," he said, and hope surged through me. "I have your sister here. I know Grace. I know what she did. Stay where you are. I'm coming to get you. Don't move. Don't let anyone take you anywhere. I'm coming." I gave him the intersection and handed the phone back to the woman. "Thank you. You just saved my life." Michael arrived in his car 7 minutes later, carrying a coat and a pair of my shoes he'd apparently retrieved from our apartment. He wrapped the coat around me, and the moment his arms closed around me, I broke down completely. "It's okay," he whispered into my hair. "It's okay. I've got you. I believe you. We're going to end this." He'd brought a photo of me, my professional headshot from my consulting website, and showed it to the woman who'd lent me her phone, explaining enough that she understood she'd helped someone genuinely in danger. Then he drove me back to Serenity Hills, his hand gripping mine so tightly it hurt. The administrative building was chaos. Police officers, facility staff, Dr. Morrison looking bewildered and defensive, Hutchins pale and sweating, and Victoria sitting in a chair with a security guard nearby, her face a mask of concerned confusion that cracked slightly when she saw me walk in with Michael. "Thank God," Victoria said, standing. "Victoria, sweetheart, you had us so worried. Running off like that, you could have hurt yourself." "Sit down," a police officer said firmly. "We're going to sort this out." Detective Rodriguez, who'd been assigned to investigate the conservatorship discrepancy, looked between us with professional skepticism. 2 identical women both claiming the same identity. This was exactly the kind of situation that required methodical verification. "This is my sister, Victoria," I said, pointing at her. "She drugged me at my wedding reception 3 weeks ago, had me committed here under my name while she took over my life. She's been living with my husband, accessing my bank accounts, pretending to be me." Victoria's laugh was perfectly calibrated, concerned, slightly sad. "This is exactly what I was afraid of. My sister's delusions have progressed to the point where she genuinely believes she's me. It's heartbreaking." She pulled out my wallet, and spread ID cards on the table. "I'm Grace Hayes. Here's my driver's license, my credit cards, my insurance card." "Those were stolen from my hotel safe," I said. I stupidly gave her the combination. "I can prove I'm Grace Hayes," Victoria continued. She rattled off my social security number, my address, details about my life that she'd spent months learning. Michael stepped forward. "Let me ask some questions. Questions only my wife would know the answers to." Rodriguez nodded. "Go ahead." "Where did we have our first kiss?" Michael asked, looking between us. Powell's bookstore? Victoria and I said, simultaneously. What's inscribed inside my wedding ring? Michael asked. Victoria hesitated. I'd never mentioned this to her, never posted it anywhere. Our initials and wedding date? 2 roads diverged, I said quietly. From the Frost poem we read to each other on our second date. You insisted on that inscription because you said choosing me was taking the road less traveled. Michael's eyes closed briefly in pain or relief. What's my mother's middle name? Grace, Victoria said confidently, because Michael's mother's first name was Linda, and Victoria had seen social media posts. Eleanor, I corrected. Same as my middle name. You told me on our 5th date when we realized we both had family members with that name. Lucky guess, Victoria said, but there was panic creeping into her voice. Show us your eyebrows, Rodriguez said. Both of you. We both tilted our heads. I touched my left eyebrow where the small scar was visible if you knew to look for it. Victoria's eyebrow was smooth, unmarked. Now show me your left inner thigh, Michael said, his voice tight. Both of you. I rolled up the sweatpants I'd stolen, revealing the pale scar from my bicycle accident at 14. Victoria paled, touching her own unblemished skin. Scars can be removed. Victoria tried, but her voice was thin. Fingerprints can't, Rodriguez said. He had the facility pull up the intake records. When Victoria Hayes was admitted, we took fingerprints as part of standard intake. Let me make a call. He contacted the FBI database, provided the prints from my intake, and waited. The response came back within minutes. These prints match Grace Hayes, fingerprinted for her financial advisor license 3 years ago. Rodriguez looked at Victoria. Ma'am, I'm going to need you to provide your fingerprints and your real name. Victoria's perfect composure finally shattered. She stood abruptly, knocking over her chair. She owed me. Her voice rose raw and desperate. 25 years ago, she tried to kill me. She pushed me into that lake and I nearly died. I lost everything because of her. My health, my future, everything. She's lived this perfect life while I suffered the consequences of what she did to me. She owed me my life back. The room went silent. Everyone stared at her, this woman who'd just confessed to an elaborate crime while trying to justify it with a childhood accident. Ma'am, Rodriguez said carefully, are you saying you're not Grace Hayes? Victoria looked at me, and in her eyes I saw 25 years of hatred, resentment, and twisted logic finally collapsing. My name is Victoria Hayes, she whispered, and she owes me everything. Victoria's confession hung in the air like smoke. For a moment, no one moved. Then she seemed to realize what she'd admitted, and something inside her broke completely. You don't understand. She turned on me, her face contorted with rage and grief. You pushed me into that water. You held me under. I was 5 years old and drowning, and you just watched. You wanted me dead even then because you were jealous that Mom loved me more. That's not... I started, but she was beyond hearing. I remember the darkness, Victoria said, her voice raw. The water filling my lungs, the burning. I remember looking up through the water and seeing you standing there on the dock, and I thought you were going to save me. But you didn't move. You just stood there. And I died. I actually died. My heart stopped for 3 minutes. The room was silent. Even Rodriguez had stopped taking notes, watching Victoria's breakdown with professional wariness mixed with something like pity. When they brought me back, I wasn't the same, Victoria continued, tears streaming down her face. The doctors told Mom and Dad the brain damage was permanent, oxygen deprivation. It affected my impulse control, my empathy, my ability to regulate emotions. But they didn't tell you, did they? They protected you from knowing what you'd done to me. I felt the familiar guilt rising, the weight I'd carried for 25 years. But something in me had changed during those weeks of imprisonment. I'd paid enough. I was 5 years old, I said quietly. Victoria, I was 5. It was an accident. I reached for a toy and you stumbled backward. I didn't push you maliciously. I didn't hold you under. I screamed for help the second you fell. I've watched that moment replay in my mind 10,000 times, and yes, I've felt guilty. But I was a child. "You took everything from me," Victoria shouted. "While you were getting perfect grades and building a career and getting married, I was broken. I had to work twice as hard for half the results because my brain doesn't work right. And Mom and Dad kept reminding me to be grateful that you felt guilty to use that guilt to get what I needed from you. They taught me that you owed me." The truth of that statement made me sick. Our parents had nurtured Victoria's resentment and my guilt in equal measure, creating a toxic dynamic that had ultimately led to this. "You made choices, Victoria," I said, my voice shaking. "The brain damage might have affected your empathy, but you still knew right from wrong. You planned this for months. You researched drugs, you recruited an accomplice, you forged documents. You knew what you were doing was illegal, or you wouldn't have hidden it. You chose revenge over getting help. You chose to hurt me instead of healing yourself." "Because you owed me!" Victoria was screaming now, and 2 officers moved closer, ready to intervene if she became violent. "Everything you have, your career, your money, your husband, your life, all of it should have been mine. I was supposed to be the successful one, the happy one. But you took that from me when you pushed me into that lake." Dr. Morrison stepped forward. "Ms. Hayes, Victoria, you need to calm down. This level of agitation? Don't tell me to calm down." Victoria whirled on him. "I spent 3 weeks locked in this place, being called by her name, being erased, and you want me to calm down?" The irony of her statement seemed lost on her. Detective Rodriguez's phone rang. He stepped aside to answer it, speaking in low tones, while Victoria continued her breakdown, cycling between rage and desperate justification. When Rodriguez returned, his expression was grim. "We've arrested Nathan Webb," he announced. "Financial advisor currently being questioned downtown. He's provided extensive documentation of a conspiracy to commit identity theft and fraud." Victoria went still. "Mr. Webb kept detailed records," Rodriguez continued. "Emails planning the identity swap, forged documents, bank transfer receipts, even audio recordings of your planning sessions. Apparently he didn't trust you not to betray him, so he kept insurance." "Nathan wouldn't," Victoria started. "He's already confessed in exchange for a plea deal. He's provided everything: the timeline, the methods, the offshore accounts. We also found your search history, Ms. Hayes. You were researching methods to cause cardiac arrest that couldn't be easily detected. This was done in the week before Ms. Grace Hayes's escape." The room temperature seemed to drop. Everyone understood what that meant. Victoria hadn't just wanted to imprison me. She'd been planning to kill me. "Victoria Hayes," Rodriguez said formally, "you're under arrest for attempted murder, kidnapping, false imprisonment, identity theft, fraud, and conspiracy. You have the right to remain silent." As he read her Miranda rights, Victoria seemed to collapse in on herself. The rage drained away, leaving only exhaustion and something that looked like despair. 2 officers moved to handcuff her. She didn't resist, but as they led her toward the door, she turned back to look at me one final time. Her face was tear-streaked mascara running my mascara that she'd been wearing while pretending to be me. For just a moment, I saw my sister, not the monster who'd stolen my life, but the damaged, traumatized girl who'd nearly drowned at 5 years old and never fully recovered. "I should have died that day at the lake," she said, her voice barely audible. "At least then I wouldn't have become this." Then they led her away, and I watched my twin sister, my identical twin, the person who'd shared a womb with me, who'd been my playmate and companion for the first years of our lives, disappear through the doorway in handcuffs, heading toward a cell instead of the psychiatric ward. Michael's arm came around me, and I leaned into him, feeling the weight of 25 years of guilt, finally fractionally beginning to lift. Victoria was right that the drowning had destroyed her life. But she was wrong that I owed her mine in return. The weeks that followed were a blur of legal proceedings, police interviews, and forensic accountants piecing together the scope of Victoria's crimes. I gave my statement so many times I could recite it in my sleep, Each telling required me to relive the wedding, the drugging, the weeks of imprisonment, the terror of not being believed. Victoria's trial began 2 months after her arrest. I sat in the courtroom every day, Michael beside me, watching my twin sister face the consequences of her choices. The prosecution laid out their case with methodical precision. They presented security footage from the Riverside Grand Hotel, grainy but clear enough to show Victoria leaning over a champagne glass, her hand moving in the distinctive motion of adding something to a drink. They presented medical records showing the specific combination of drugs found in my system drugs that had no legitimate medical reason to be there. They had Nathan's testimony delivered in exchange for his plea deal, describing months of planning and conspiracy. They had the forged conservatorship documents, the falsified medical records, the bank transfer receipts showing $300,000 systematically stolen from my accounts. And they had Victoria's own confession witnessed by police medical staff and recorded on facility security cameras. Victoria's defense attorney, an expensive lawyer our parents had hired, attempted to argue diminished capacity. He brought in neurologists who examined Victoria and confirmed what our family had hidden for 25 years. The drowning had caused measurable brain damage. MRI scans showed areas of scarring in regions associated with emotional regulation and empathy. Neuropsychological testing revealed deficits in impulse control and moral reasoning. My client is not entirely responsible for her actions, the defense attorney argued. The oxygen deprivation she suffered at age 5 fundamentally altered her brain function. She lacks the capacity for normal empathy and judgment that most people possess. The prosecutor stood and methodically dismantled that argument. She presented Victoria's search history, months of careful research into sedatives, identity theft procedures, offshore banking. She showed Victoria's practice signatures, dozens of pages, where she'd perfected my handwriting. She presented the timeline, 6 months of planning recruiting, Nathan researching Serenity Hills, creating false medical records. This was not the impulsive act of someone with diminished capacity, the prosecutor said. This was calculated, methodical, and sophisticated. The defendant knew what she was doing was illegal. That's why she took such elaborate steps to hide it. She understood right from wrong. That's why she created false medical records to justify her actions. She may have neurological differences, but she is fully capable of criminal intent. The judge, after reviewing all the evidence and expert testimony, agreed. While I acknowledge the defendant has neurological abnormalities resulting from childhood trauma, I find that she possessed sufficient capacity to understand the nature and consequences of her actions. The extensive premeditation and sophisticated planning demonstrate clear criminal intent. Victoria was convicted on all counts. At sentencing, the judge imposed 15 years in prison with mandatory psychiatric treatment. It wasn't the maximum sentence attempted murder could carry, but it was substantial. "You will have time to reflect on your choices," the judge told Victoria, "and to receive treatment for the psychological and neurological issues that contributed to this tragedy. But make no mistake, you are being held accountable for the deliberate harm you caused." Nathan received 8 years for conspiracy and fraud. His financial license was permanently revoked. During his sentencing, he'd tried to claim he'd been manipulated by Victoria, but the prosecution presented evidence of his own grudge against me. The HR complaint, the lost promotion, his eagerness for revenge wrapped in financial gain. The court ordered full restitution. Forensic accountants had traced most of the stolen money through its labyrinthine path of transfers and offshore accounts. I recovered approximately $255,000 directly. Nathan's personal assets, his condo, his car, his investment accounts were seized and liquidated to cover the remaining $45,000. I lost about $15,000 to the various fees and some cash that had been converted to cryptocurrency and was genuinely untraceable. But considering I'd nearly lost my life along with my money, the financial recovery felt almost miraculous. Serenity Hills faced its own reckoning. The state medical board launched an investigation into how a patient had been held for 3 weeks on fraudulent documentation without anyone questioning the legitimacy of the conservatorship papers. Gerald Hutchins, the administrator who'd accepted Nathan's bribe, was fired and faced criminal charges for his role in the conspiracy. He eventually pleaded guilty to accepting illegal payments and served 18 months in prison. Dr. Morrison was cleared of wrongdoing. He'd acted in good faith based on what appeared to be legitimate medical records, but the experience devastated him. He testified that he'd been completely deceived, that the falsified history was so detailed and professional that he'd had no reason to question it. I watched him on the stand, this man who'd unknowingly kept me imprisoned, and felt an odd sympathy. He'd been a tool in Victoria's plan, manipulated like everyone else. The facility itself faced multiple lawsuits and a comprehensive licensing review. They implemented new protocols for verifying legal documentation and background checking family members who claimed authority over patients' care. But the most painful part of the legal process was when my parents were called to testify about our family history. They sat in the witness box, my mother pale and trembling, my father's face carefully blank, while the prosecutor asked them about the drowning, about how they'd raised us afterward, about the dynamic they'd created. "You told Grace she owed her sister," the prosecutor said, reading from a deposition. "You said, and I quote, 'You owe her more than anyone can repay. You owe her your unconditional support always. Is that correct?" My mother nodded, tears streaming down her face. "And you never told Grace about the extent of Victoria's brain damage." "We wanted to protect her from the guilt," my mother whispered. "Instead, you weaponized that guilt. You created an environment where Victoria believed she was entitled to Grace's entire life as compensation." The courtroom was silent. My parents had no criminal liability. They hadn't known about Victoria's plan, hadn't participated in the crimes. But their role in creating the psychological conditions that enabled those crimes was laid bare for everyone to see. After the trial concluded, my mother approached me in the courthouse hallway. "Grace, please, I'm so sorry. We never meant we were trying to help Victoria cope with her disability. We thought, you thought I should pay for an accident I had when I was 5 years old." I said, my voice flat. "You made me believe I deserved punishment for being a child. You created an environment where Victoria thought she was owed my life. I was your daughter too, Mom. You should have protected me." "I know," she sobbed. "I know, and I'm so sorry. Please, can we—" "I can't," I said. "Not now. Maybe not ever. You need to own what you did. Not just apologize because you got caught enabling it." I walked away, leaving my parents in that hallway, their family shattered by the consequences of 25 years of toxic dynamics. Justice had been served. Victoria would spend 15 years in prison. Nathan was locked away. The people and institutions that had enabled my imprisonment faced their consequences. But I still had to figure out how to rebuild a life that had been stolen, how to reclaim an identity that had been erased, and whether forgiveness was possible or even necessary for me to heal. The first weeks after the trial felt like trying to reassemble a life from scattered pieces. I'd been legally imprisoned as Victoria Hayes for 3 weeks, then spent another 2 months navigating the legal system to prove what Victoria had done. Now I had to rebuild everything she'd contaminated. My attorney helped me file documentation with credit agencies explaining the fraud and identity theft. Every account Victoria had touched needed verification, restoration, updates. My professional licenses required affidavits explaining why Grace Hayes had been unreachable for weeks. Background check services needed documentation for future employers showing I'd been the victim, not the perpetrator of identity fraud. It was exhausting bureaucratic work that forced me to relive the trauma with every form I filled out. The worst was returning to my apartment. Michael offered to go in first to clear out anything of Victoria's, but I needed to see it myself. I needed to understand the full scope of what she'd done. Walking through that door felt like visiting a crime scene. Everything looked familiar but wrong. My furniture was there, but arranged slightly differently. My clothes hung in the closet, but some were missing, presumably the ones Victoria had worn so much they carried her scent instead of mine. My personal items had been reorganized according to Victoria's preferences, rather than my own careful systems. I found a journal in my nightstand that I'd never written. Victoria's handwriting. My handwriting really, since she'd practiced it so extensively, filled pages with her thoughts about living my life. Today, Michael told me he loves me. He doesn't know it's me he's loving, not her, but it still feels good. I think I could get used to this. I threw the journal away without reading more. I didn't want to know what she'd thought while wearing my skin. Michael and I agreed immediately we couldn't live there. Too many ghosts. Too many violated spaces. We found a new apartment together, something neither of us had history with, and I donated most of my furniture to charity. Fresh start, clean slate. My employer, Morrison Financial Consulting, was remarkably supportive. Margaret Yoshida, my supervisor, had been one of the first people Sarah Chen had contacted during her investigation. She'd known something was wrong when I'd disappeared without explanation. When the full story broke, and it did break, making regional news as a bizarre case of twin identity theft, the firm released a statement supporting me and offering whatever leave I needed to recover. "Take 6 months," Margaret told me during our first meeting after the trial. "Full pay, your clients understand, and Grace, when you're ready to come back, you'll have a place here. What happened to you? No one should have to go through that." The public sympathy was both comforting and exhausting. Strangers recognized me from news coverage and offered condolences as though someone had died. In a way, someone had the version of me that existed before Victoria drugged my champagne was gone forever. My parents were another matter entirely. They called, constantly left voicemails begging for a chance to explain, sent letters that I returned unopened. Finally, my mother showed up at my new apartment, and I had to confront the situation directly. "Grace, please just talk to me," she pleaded through the door. "We never meant for this to happen. We were trying to help Victoria cope with her disability. We thought we were doing the right thing." I opened the door but didn't invite her in. "You thought making me feel guilty for an accident I had at age 5 was the right thing? You thought reminding me constantly that I owed Victoria my entire life was helpful parenting." "We didn't know she'd take it this far," my mother said, tears streaming. "How could we have known? You created the environment that made her think she was entitled to my life," I said. "Every time you told me I owed her. Every time you prioritized her feelings over mine. Every time you made me responsible for her happiness, you taught her that I existed to serve her needs." "I'm sorry," my mother sobbed. "I'm so sorry." "I'm sure you are, but I'm not ready to forgive you. I might never be ready. Right now, I need space to heal from what your parenting allowed to happen. I need you to get therapy and understand how you contributed to this. And I need you to stop making this about your guilt and start thinking about the harm you caused." I closed the door on her protests, and later that week I wrote them both a letter making my boundaries explicit. No visits, no calls, no letters expecting responses. When and if I was ready for contact, I would initiate it. Their guilt was not my responsibility to manage anymore. My therapist called it a breakthrough. I called it survival. Michael and I had our own healing to do. We'd been married for exactly 1 day before Victoria destroyed everything. The man I loved had lived with my sister for 2 weeks, believing she was me. He'd kissed her, slept beside her, shared intimate space with someone wearing my face. "I keep replaying every interaction," Michael admitted during one of our couples counseling sessions. "Trying to figure out how I didn't know. What kind of husband doesn't recognize his own wife? She studied me for 6 months," I reminded him. "She knew things about me even I didn't consciously realize. And you'd only known me for 2 years. You didn't have 25 years of history to compare against." But the violation remained. My marriage bed felt contaminated. Physical intimacy was complicated by intrusive thoughts. Was I touching him the same way Victoria had? Did he see her when he looked at me? Our therapist suggested we create new rituals, new memories that belonged only to us. We sold the bed Victoria had slept in and bought a new one together. We established small traditions: Saturday morning coffee on the balcony, Wednesday evening walks things Victoria had never been part of. 4 months after the trial, Michael surprised me. I know we're not ready for a big ceremony, but I want to choose you again, consciously, with full knowledge of everything we've been through. We renewed our vows in a tiny ceremony with just 2 friends as witnesses. No family, no elaborate planning, just us choosing each other deliberately, fully aware of the trauma we carried and committed to healing together. It wasn't perfect. Some nights I still woke from nightmares about Serenity Hills. Some days Michael still flinched when I wore my hair a certain way that reminded him of Victoria. But we were choosing each other actively and intentionally, and that felt like its own kind of miracle. 6 months after Victoria's sentencing, I made a decision that surprised even my therapist. I was going to visit my sister in prison. Not to forgive her, not to reconcile, but to close a chapter that had defined too much of my life. I needed to face Victoria one final time on my terms from a position of strength rather than victimhood. I told my therapist about my decision during our weekly session. She listened without judgment, then asked simply, "Why do you want to see her?" "I need to know I'm not afraid of her anymore," I said. "I need to see her in prison powerless and know that she can't hurt me. I need to say what I need to say and then leave on my terms." "Are you looking for an apology?" "No," I said and realized I meant it. "I'm looking for closure, for myself, not for her." Michael offered to drive me to the correctional facility to wait in the parking lot to be there if I needed him. But this was something I needed to do alone. This was my story to close, my narrative to reclaim. The drive took an hour and a half. I'd never been to a prison before. The Columbia River Correctional Institution was a sprawling complex of concrete and chain-link industrial and deliberately unwelcoming. I went through security metal detectors, bag searches, identity verification, and was directed to the visiting room. Victoria was already seated when I arrived, a guard standing discreetly nearby. She wore an orange jumpsuit that washed out her complexion, her hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, no makeup to hide behind. She looked smaller somehow, diminished by the surroundings and circumstances. For just a moment, I felt the old flutter of sympathy. This was my sister, my twin. We'd shared a womb, shared a childhood, shared a face. And now she sat in a prison visiting room facing 15 years behind bars. Then she spoke and the sympathy evaporated. "I knew you'd come eventually," Victoria said, her voice carrying that familiar edge of resentment. "You always did have to have the last word." I sat down across from her, separated by a table bolted to the floor. "I'm not here to argue with you." "Then why are you here to gloat, to see me humiliated?" "I'm here to say goodbye." Victoria laughed, bitter and sharp. "This is your fault, you know, all of it. If you'd just stayed away, lived your life somewhere else, I wouldn't have had to do what I did. But you kept succeeding, kept being happy, kept rubbing it in my face. Every achievement, every milestone, you were reminding me of everything I lost." I'd expected this, the blame, the refusal to take responsibility, but hearing it still stung. "I didn't rub anything in your face," I said quietly. "I hid my success from the family for years. I made myself small to avoid making you feel bad. I paid for your failed businesses. I apologized for an accident I had when I was 5 years old. What more was I supposed to do?" "You were supposed to suffer like I suffered." Victoria leaned forward, intensity burning in her eyes. "You took my future. You damaged my brain. You got to be the healthy one, the successful one, the happy one, while I struggled with every single thing. Do you know what it's like to work twice as hard as everyone else and still fail? To know your brain doesn't work right because of what someone else did to you." "I was 5. I said, and my voice didn't shake. That was progress. "I was a child reaching for a toy. It was an accident, Victoria. A terrible, tragic accident. But it was not attempted murder. I didn't push you maliciously. I didn't want you dead. I was a little girl who made a mistake. You stood there and watched me drown. I screamed for help the second you fell. I was terrified, and I've carried guilt about it for 25 years, guilt that you and Mom and Dad weaponized against me. But I'm done carrying it now. Victoria sat back, crossing her arms. So you're here to absolve yourself. How nice for you. I'm here to tell you the truth, I said. I'm sorry you almost died when we were 5. I'm sorry you suffered brain damage. I'm sorry the oxygen deprivation affected your empathy and impulse control. And I'm deeply sorry that our parents made everything worse by constantly reminding me I owed you while never getting you proper therapeutic help. Victoria's expression shifted slightly, surprised maybe at the acknowledgement. But Victoria, I'm not sorry for having a life. I'm not sorry for being successful or happy or getting married. Those weren't things I stole from you. Those were things I earned through hard work and discipline and years of effort. You could have built your own life. You could have gotten therapy for your trauma and your neurological differences. You could have created something meaningful instead of destroying what I'd built. Easy for you to say when you have a normal brain, Victoria spat. You're right, I said. I don't know what it's like to live with brain damage. I don't know how much of your obsessive thinking and lack of empathy was neurological and how much was choice. But I know you planned this for months. I know you researched and prepared and manipulated systems. That took intelligence and forethought. You knew it was wrong, that's why you hid it. You made choices, Victoria, and now you're facing the consequences of those choices. I should have killed you when I had the chance. Victoria said, her voice cold. The words should have frightened me. Instead, they just made me sad. Maybe you're right that your brain damage made it harder for you to feel empathy or control your impulses, I said. But even with those challenges, you had options. You chose revenge over healing. You chose destruction over building. And that's on you. I stood up. Victoria's eyes widened slightly. She'd expected me to engage, to argue, to give her the confrontation she wanted. I hope someday you take responsibility for what you did, I said. I hope you use these 15 years to get real psychiatric help and work on the parts of yourself you can control. But I'm not waiting around to see if you do. This is goodbye, Victoria. I'm moving forward with my life, without you. Grace, wait. But I was already walking away. Victoria called after me, her voice rising, trying to pull me back into argument or negotiation, or the endless cycle of guilt and obligation. But I kept walking past the guard through the security checkpoint out into the parking lot where weak winter sunlight filtered through clouds. I got into my car and sat for a moment, hands on the steering wheel, breathing deeply. I felt lighter. Not healed healing would take time, but lighter, freer. I didn't need Victoria's remorse or understanding or acknowledgement. I'd said what I needed to say. I'd faced her from a position of strength and walked away on my own terms. I started the car and drove toward home, toward Michael, toward the life I was rebuilding. I didn't look back at the prison in my rearview mirror. I was done looking back. 1 year after walking out of that prison, I stood in my new office, not a cubicle at someone else's firm, but my own space with my name on the door. Hayes Consulting Group had 15 clients, 3 employees, and a reputation for excellence that I'd stopped hiding. The wall behind my desk displayed my credentials, openly MBA CFP certification testimonials from satisfied clients. No more pretending to be less than I was. Michael appeared in the doorway holding 2 cups of coffee. We'd moved into a light-filled condo in northwest Portland, a space we'd chosen together with no ghosts haunting the corners. The walls were painted colors I loved, sage green in the living room, warm gray in the bedroom. Every piece of furniture was new, chosen deliberately, carrying no memories of Victoria's contamination. "Still thinking about Bali?" Michael asked, handing me a cup. Our delayed honeymoon finally happening. 2 weeks in Indonesia, just us creating memories that belonged only to our marriage. We'd waited until we were ready, until intimacy felt safe again, until we could look at each other without seeing the shadow of what Victoria had stolen. "I'm thinking we've earned it," I said. My phone buzzed a text from an old college friend I'd reconnected with. "Dinner next week." Over the past year, I'd rebuilt relationships that had withered when all my emotional energy had gone to managing family dysfunction and carrying guilt. I'd learned to invest in people who gave as much as they took, who celebrated my success instead of resenting it. My mother's weekly call came that afternoon. We'd established a careful rhythm lunch once every few months, brief phone calls, boundaries that were non-negotiable. They'd done therapy, had apologized more genuinely, acknowledging their role without expecting immediate forgiveness. Grace. I was thinking, my mother said carefully. Victoria's birthday is next month. Maybe we could visit her together. It might mean a lot to her. You're welcome to visit her, I said. But I won't be joining you. She's your daughter, and you get to choose what relationship you want with her. But I've chosen mine, which is none. She's still your sister. And she's also the person who drugged me, imprisoned me, and planned to kill me. Blood relation doesn't obligate me to forgive or maintain contact. My mother was quiet. A year ago, she would have argued, would have pressured, would have reminded me of what I supposedly owed. But therapy had taught her slowly, painfully, that her guilt wasn't mine to resolve. I understand, she said finally. I don't like it, but I understand. Some extended family members called me cold, unforgiving, harsh. I'd learned to let them think what they wanted. Protecting yourself isn't selfish. Setting boundaries isn't cruelty. I didn't owe anyone access to my life simply because we shared DNA. That evening, Michael and I walked along the waterfront watching the sunset paint the river gold. I thought about everything that had changed, everything I'd learned, everything I'd reclaimed. For 25 years, I'd believed I owed Victoria my life because of an accident I had no control over. I'd let guilt define every choice, every boundary, every relationship. I'd made myself small to accommodate her resentment and my parents' enabling. What I understood now was that some debts are impossible to repay because they're not actually owed. I was 5 years old. It was an accident. And even if it hadn't been, even if I had deliberately pushed her, no one owes their entire existence to someone else. Not to family, not to anyone. Victoria had chosen hatred over healing. My parents had chosen guilt over healthy boundaries. And I had finally chosen myself. Not forgiveness on someone else's timeline. Not reconciliation at the cost of my peace. But my own life on my own terms with people who truly loved me. The real lesson wasn't about forgiving those who hurt you. It was about refusing to sacrifice yourself to make others comfortable. Some chapters needed to be closed, not healed. And that was okay. I squeezed Michael's hand as we walked, the city lights beginning to glow around us, my future spreading out ahead like the river wide deep, and finally, my own. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is stop owing people who never deserved your debt in the first place. Grace's story didn't end with forgiveness or a perfect family reunion. It ended with her choosing herself, setting boundaries, and reclaiming the life that was stolen from her. Sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is recognize that we don't owe anyone our peace, our safety, or our entire existence just because they're family. If Grace's journey resonated with you, if you've ever felt the weight of impossible expectations or guilt that wasn't truly yours to carry, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever had to set boundaries with family? How did you find the courage to choose yourself? Please subscribe to this channel for more true stories about resilience, justice, and women who refuse to stay silent. Hit that like button if Grace's story moved you, and share this with anyone who needs to hear that it's okay to stop paying debts they never owed. Thank you for listening to Grace's story. Until next time, remember your life belongs to you.